Did you read the comments on Jeff's episode?
Just a few.
I was like, and you still came on. Interesting.
The blood pressure goes.
The balls.
Yeah, you gotta be like.
The HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Hoyt.
What can we say, man? Another year back with Hoyt. We're both shooting RX8s. I'm shooting 70 pounds in the bourbon, which I love bourbon.
It's great.
And you're shooting 80 pounds in the straight black.
Blacked out as always, man. I got the, so I'm shooting the 500 grain Easton Arrow this year. And at 80 pounds, I'm flinging that thing at like 300 feet per second. I mean, it's deadly. Put a water buffalo in front of me and he's done.
I mean, we shot it earlier. You literally put an arrow through a brand new target, like never been shot before.
I know. So one other thing that Hoyt is doing this year is they're making all their own strings in-house. And so the quality is top notch and it just really is something that is setting them apart from their competitors.
Well, what we always try to do when we go to our bow shop, Ultimate Outdoors, is we try to shoot other bows just to make sure that we are really giving everybody a fair chance.
Sure.
The reality is it's a no-brainer. Hoyt, it stands above all of them every single time.
Definitely. And so right now you can use code HUNTR, HUNTR, for 20% off any apparel on the Hoyt website. And as always,
get serious, get Hoyt. And we're back.
Ew.
HUNTR Podcast.
I like to hang those out a little bit.
Episode 2, what did we say? 240.
Toof hurty no longer.
Wow. 240. Pretty crazy. Getting up there. What we hit, we'll be under 300 this year. By the time the year's done. Well, I don't know. We do those doubles and stuff. Maybe we hit 300 this year.
There are some shows out there that I'm like, they rack them up. You know what I mean? I know. I'm sure I'll get it wrong, but I think like working class are maybe on 700 something. I think even Bo is on 400 something. I'm like, I don't know how,
And Bo said, well, I was listening to his the other day. He said, I guess the first time that Johnny was on the podcast was in 2019. So it was 2 years before we started. I don't know how long ago.
Wow.
How much before that he started the podcast itself. But
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Anyways,
seems like just yesterday.
We're getting there at 240. It's impressive. I mean, when you sit down and, times, 2 to 3 hours a piece, do the math here. We've been here for days.
Days.
We've been here sitting at this
long time,
at least days, not weeks,
It's pretty impressive. I mean, I think there's only been a handful of times that we've had voice struggles in that 4.5 year jaunt of podcasting. You think like at some point, like, because we talk to a lot of people, not just on the podcast, like throughout the day. And every once in a while you feel it creeping up, but not
voice
recently.
Strain. Yeah, I don't really get that.
Have been training the muscles.
Dude, I knock on wood here. I haven't been sick since.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. I got through the whole show season. Nothing.
Yep.
Not this year anyways. You know what I mean? So far.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember. Maybe there was a glimpse of something during season last year, but you'll have that. That's
you just
normal
power
wear and
through
tear.
it though. Like when you get sick, you just like try to kill it.
It usually works.
Yeah, like you don't just like, oh, I'm gonna rest and like you will.
I get in a sauna.
You will take a power nap that lasts for 24 hours probably, but like other than that, you just like keep ramming. It's been a
minute since I've had a full day on the couch. It's usually just I see it coming and I crush it with Zycam. Crush it with Zycam and anything else I can get in me, and I sweat as much as I can and drink as much water as I can.
I think that's a good plan.
I start putting honey in my coffee when that happens. Help the throat.
That'll help.
Yeah.
That'll help.
Just hit it. Just crush it early, and usually you can beat it.
Yeah, this is kind of that weird time of year because, like, when I just came back from Kentucky, it was like 70 degrees down there. I'm like, holy cow.
It wasn't here. It got up to like in the 50s, I think.
Yeah, and then we're gonna drop the bottom out to like the teens, like next week in the.
Really?
Yeah, in the mornings and
is
stuff.
It?
Oh yeah.
I thought it was supposed to stay warm here.
It will get back. It's just up and down, up and down.
Yeah, I spent 8 hours on a pressure washer the other day. Start to finish.
Yeah, that's a lot. Saw Margie, posting that on the old Insta. I thought it was interesting, and it did what we thought. You said you listened. I haven't. You listened back to the Josh podcast last week?
The Talker?
Yeah. It did really well in terms of getting people to think about just, we covered a broad stroke of topics there. Like, obviously, I think you clickbaited them a bit with the crossbows in the title. But
people love the crossbows, man.
But, I thought that we got a lot.
It wasn't really clickbait. The whole podcast was about crossfire.
We got a lot of responses. Just and whether they agree with it or not, it's the whole point is to get people talking about that stuff and have discussions. And there were surprisingly, I thought there were quite a few people that really took to our conversation around the public resource and monetizing the public resource, which is not an easy. There is no easy answer there. Like I don't know, but I think at least having people talk about it and think about it is critical. So, appreciate everybody chiming in there and saying your piece. We, good or bad, we'll take it.
Yeah, I mean it's a tough conversation to have because it's like there's not like a clear solution. You know what I mean? And any possible solution requires sacrifice and
from somebody,
from somebody or everybody. It's hard to get everybody on the same page to agree on something before you take that step. And it's just,
Yeah. And I mean, when it affects you, I'm not saying like you, but whoever affects you, then you obviously are more defensive of it. We see that at the federal level happening right now. It's like there are certain people that support things that are going on, but then all of a sudden it trickles down and affects you, and you're like, whoa,
IRS doesn't want to get audited. Whoa.
Yeah, whoa, wait a minute here.
We do the auditing right here.
So, I mean, it's definitely it's a good conversation to have. I thought that one maybe unintentionally made people uncomfortable. But that's what we like to do sometimes from that side. But anyways, so we've got a cool guest today and kind of going on the topic of, things that are just hot button items and just constantly come up, and we've had discussion points on chronic wasting disease in the past. Right. And so,
and I don't really truthfully feel like I know any more about it now than I did when we started all that.
Well, it's,
unfortunately,
there's so many different stakeholders in the CWD discussions, from us as the hunters to people that are the heads of departments to our guest today, who's more on the research side of things. And so I think that as you start to look at those kind of stakeholders, they all have a different input and a different view on how they see chronic wasting disease. And
it'd be all the same stakeholders as that pertain to deer populations. Everything. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So ag being a giant one, insurance, motor vehicle is a huge one. Hunters are in there, and then just the general public.
Yep. And, I think that in the past, some of the stakeholders that we've had on, I won't say that it's been opinionated, but it definitely is coming from their specific viewpoint and how they're seeing and how they would describe what's happening with CWD. And so we've got Dan Storm on today from Wisconsin DNR, and Dan and his team here, I guess just last month in January, basically did this big release of a long project that they have been working on, and Dan can correct us. I think he's continuing to look at stuff here that has looked very closely at several counties in Wisconsin that have been kind of at the center of the CWD bullseye here for probably 20 years. And I would say maybe for the first time, laid out definitive numbers in respect to deer that are infected with CWD and their annual survival rates, as well as, statements of what is causing some of these deer with CWD to die. And, for whatever reason, maybe it's just because of the political stuff we're seeing at the federal government level, I've seen an increase in the last 2 weeks from, whether it's the Ted Nugents of the world or whoever, who are just on the CWD soapbox at this point. And I think that, again, from a stakeholder side, I get everybody's different viewpoint, but the one thing that, as a biologist, I really believe in is the research aspect of things. And it's like, hey, if I'm looking at this with a non-biased view and it's like, here's what the data is, and Dan's going to talk about interpretation of that. But even if you look at the data and interpret it differently, it's like the data is the data, whether we want to believe it or acknowledge it or whatever, this is what it is. And I think for you and I, our discussions have always wrapped around, okay, well, now having that, what's next?
Yeah. Well, that's where the disagreement happens. It's like, okay, what do we do about it? It's like, it's hard. It's, facts are facts. And I mean, I guess you can, and we might today, push back on how studies are done and stuff, but, at least if you can collect information and we can agree that, hey, this is what we're seeing, then all right, at least you have a starting point, to go forth and make decisions.
Yeah.
So,
and then the now what?
Exactly.
Right. Becomes the big one. So, pretty excited. Talk to Dan about the research that they've been doing up there. And this is a big project. And, obviously Wisconsin's kind of been, really the focus of CWD for so long. Now it's expanded much more across the U.S., but from a whitetail side, it's like this population has had it detected probably for the longest, in a very whitetail deep-rooted tradition state of hunting. What are we seeing 20 years later, basically, and where's this going, and what do we do about it? Those are the questions. So
that is the question.
That is.
To be or not to be.
That's it. Remember, bring Dan in? All right, Dan. We got you, buddy. Appreciate you coming on this afternoon to talk with us a little bit.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Well, it's hopefully we, Jared and I always probably kind of kick off the first conversation with the guests of like, we apologize a little bit for just kind of going off on tangents there in the pre-podcast, but, we try to set the tone. But I guess maybe just for some of our listeners and stuff, if you would just kind of give a background of, your current position at the DNR and anything you want from a background side. We even talked pre-podcast about going to Southern Illinois. I mean, the more information, the better for our guests, to give to our audience so that they can understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I'm the deer research scientist for the Wisconsin DNR. And I've been in this position for a little over 10 years. Before that, I got my PhD at UW-Madison, studying deer, chronic wasting disease. Got my master's at Southern Illinois, where I, collared a bunch of deer and kind of did that sort of traditional deer research stuff. Got my bachelor's at South Dakota State because I'm from out there. I grew up mostly in Fargo, North Dakota. So very different. Very different perspective growing up on deer, where, I grew up deer hunting. That's why I got into this. But like, I didn't see deer that often. And, when you're hunting, if we saw deer, that was a good day, right?
Right.
Totally different perspective. And, coming to Southern Illinois, and it's like, whoa, there's deer everywhere. Going to Wisconsin, there's deer. It's just a whole different perspective once you get to the Midwest and getting into this sort of heart of whitetail world. Yeah.
It's funny when you talk about kind of that movement, like, it seems like everybody that finds themselves in, a deer related position, at an agency level, but even take a step back as the transition from an undergraduate where most people are, fairly close to home when they do their undergraduate studies. And then in the wildlife field, and we've talked about this in the past, I think with Carl Miller and Craig Harper's, you're not just applying to go to grad school, like you're applying for specific positions and research projects. And so, it's very much like, here's the job. Now here's all these applications that happen. And because of that, most of us end up leaving, our home turf of where we grew up and end up in, a much different culture. For me, I went from Pennsylvania to Mississippi, and so it was like you take a kid from the north and then you put him in Starkville, Mississippi, and it's like, it's a complete culture change.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's
very eye-opening. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's good too, right? Because those different cultures and those different experiences is what, broadens you out to be a better biologist at the end of the day.
I mean, I wouldn't have believed it if you had told me when I was like a college kid how many deer there were. I remember a guy, a fellow undergrad was from Iowa, and he brought photos from the recent hunt they had, and they had like a dozen dead deer in one photo. I was like, in several huge bucks. I'm like, how is that even possible?
Yeah.
Like it was just a whole nother, I just had no concept until I moved out of here.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, Dan, so when did you start at the Wisconsin DNR?
I started, I had like a temporary position starting in like 2011. And then with this job at 2013.
Okay. So since 2013, so crazy as it seems, a dozen years at this point.
Yeah.
Hard to believe that fast, but maybe just before we even get into the details of kind of some of the stuff we're talking today, but it seems like at least from my familiarity with a lot of the agencies and stuff, most agencies have deer biologists on staff, but they don't necessarily have research biologists on staff. Can you talk through a little bit of the difference there of like maybe what your role is versus the actual Wisconsin deer biologist side of things?
Yeah, sure. And you guys had a podcast with Jeff Pritzl.
Yeah, Jeff was just on ago. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my counterpart on the management side. And it's really mixed. Every state does it a little bit differently. But Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, we all have sort of independent research programs, or to some extent independent. And so like my job is to conduct research, to provide information for decision makers. Mm-hmm. And also that's part of it. Like, okay, let's do a research project to answer some research need that's been identified by our agency. And then secondarily, I'm a part of the sort of annual deer monitoring process and like quota setting process. So providing population estimates and analysis of harvest data, analysis of like our fawn to doe ratio data, that sort of stuff. So that's the two sort of prongs of my job. And, there's a lot of scrutiny on deer in Wisconsin. There always has been. And there's, like, as Jeff said, I believe in your podcast, there's almost always been a research sort of wing in the DNR. And it's nice. It's a little bit unique, but not totally. In a lot of Western states too, they have their dedicated research staff, which sit a little bit apart, but work hand in hand with their management staff.
Mm-hmm. And then do you guys, I assume, work closely with some of the universities then in the state as well?
We do. And in fact, the project that I think you wanted to talk about mostly here today was a collaboration with University of Wisconsin-Madison, the USGS Wildlife Cooperative Research Unit, which is embedded within that university.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. So that makes sense. So like here in Pennsylvania, like I know our game commission works really close with the USGS Wildlife Cooperative, which is embedded within Penn State here. So exactly. It's those relationships that I think, just from a foundational level for a lot of our listeners to understand how that happens. But like in your case, you're very much the data side, right, of the deer management aspect. And Jeff was pretty open with us. He's like, I'm the people guy, right? Like that's exactly. Kind of my end of things. Transparently, you probably have it a little easier with the the deer.
Did you read the comments on Jeff's episode?
Just a few.
I was like, and you still came on. Interesting.
The blood pressure goes.
The balls.
You gotta be like, all right.
Well, it was interesting. It was interesting because I mean, Jeremy and I left that conversation feeling like, man, this guy really well spoken. I mean, I agree or disagree, and we are not from Wisconsin, so and we don't hunt there really, so we don't have a dog in the fight. We're just looking to learn, and so we left feeling like, hey, guy's really well spoken in this, and then. And I think there was some of that in the comments, but the other half was like, this guy is the reason that like the state is like, down the shitter in their opinion. And I can see that perspective, but anyways, it's interesting to know your dynamics. So we have some context going into this conversation here.
At least I say, hey, it's not me. I'm not the reason.
I just supplied the information.
Don't shoot the messenger.
Right. Well, sometimes they might like to, but we got 500,000 hunters ish, and you're going to get it all. You're just going to get it all. And people are understandably frustrated. Like there's absolutely a good reason for them to be frustrated. There's things that are in our control. There's things that are not in our control.
Sure.
It just makes it it's a tricky job for Jeff and somewhat for me, but not as much. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, it's hard for a lot of us now, if we look at everybody from, 20 years old to even 50, which is a lion's share of the hunting community, even though we are aging out. Like, if you go back into the early 2000s or you go back into the 90s and you pick any of the major deer hunting states, there's always been turmoil, always.
Absolutely.
And it's because of the passion and I mean, the whitetail deer is king. Like it just is in this area of the country. It's what drives a lot of the revenue for the states, has the most participants into it. So anytime you have a limited resource and you put it in that kind of a situation, like people are going to have emotional reactions to it.
Yeah. I mean, deer a lot of places, Wisconsin, it's more than just a hobby. It's like for a lot of folks, it's their number one sort of thing outside of work and family. And
Yep.
it's got a meaning to it. Deer hunting has a meaning to it that's greater than, like, I'm guessing for a lot of people, golf, right? It just means more. It's got a cultural importance. It just matters more. And people just, I've heard people have called it like the secular religion of Wisconsin, deer hunting,
Yeah.
And it's been that way literally since before Aldo Leopold was on the scene, right? Like, it's been that way forever. And yes, we're losing hunters. That's happening across almost the nation. But we still have a lot of hunters, and they're still very passionate. This means a lot to them. And so, yeah, it's like, yeah, they're going to care. And if it's not going right for them, they're going to let us know about it, as they should. Yeah.
If we can, I can just throw this at you because you're the research guy, and it's okay if you don't know the answer. It's okay to say you don't know, but I
might say that a lot today. We'll see.
That's perfect. That's our main scapegoat too. Is, hey, we don't know.
I don't
know. You mentioned that we have like declining hunter numbers across the country. Generally speaking, can I ask, as a blanket statement, why you think that is? Not why do you sense that it's declining, but why do you think it's declining? Make sense?
Yeah. So it's funny you asked that, and I could go a few different ways, because today we just got notification from the Journal of Wildlife Management that a paper that we submitted to them on the hunter decline in Wisconsin got accepted.
Oh, wow. Very cool.
In
Congrats.
a couple of months or whatever, that should be out, where we looked at the demographics of hunters, because you kind of hinted at already, about like they're aging out.
Yep.
There's that aspect of demographics that's there. And that is true. We got that pulse of baby boomers that took to hunting like no other generation before or since, and they're aging out, and that's going to happen. But really, what's the problem is, when you look at it, we can't look at it as just like the baby boomers are aging out, because what's happening is, of basically all ages, everyone is just hunting less. We're losing hunters across the board. We're recruiting hunters at a lower rate. So there's just less, and we're doing more research now to look at what are the constraints. Like what is it that's caught, because we're losing. The next line of research is, well, where are we losing hunters faster, and where are we losing hunters less quickly?
Yep.
And so we're losing hunters quickly, the quickest, the fastest in our the counties that have an older population, all right, back to that sort of demographics question, but also on the most densely populated.
Which is where access is probably the hardest.
Yeah. So think about, so you may not know Wisconsin as much, but like southeast Wisconsin's where Milwaukee is. It's like just kind of where Chicago. That's our most heavy populated part of the state. That's also where you got to drive the furthest. Like that's the corner of the state. Our public land is in the central part of the state, but mostly up north. And the tradition had been like this mass movement of hunters every fall up north. It's a big time commitment, right? You got to drive 5 hours, maybe 6 hours, 8 hours. Like it's a long time. Access to hunting land in those heavily urbanized counties is very limited, obviously. And so they're kind of stuck. And then you add on like just competing demands for time, limited income. And at some point there's this calculus, I guess, in their head where it's no longer worth it. And there's, that's I think kind of I think that's that competing time. There's less time folks have. There's also like the social tie, the social element of it is that kind of breaks down. I think that accelerates it. I mean, if your buddies are going to hunt, you're probably going to make more time, or it's going to be more important to you to make more time. But if you're not, all of a sudden your kid wants to play fall ball, whatever. And all of a sudden And last time I went, I didn't see the deer I was hoping to see. And then all of a sudden these sort of factors.
I think that's a huge piece of it. I mean, Mike Rex from Ohio, I think, was the one who said it best, in that, he related a lot of it to the erosion of the American family. If you think back to the baby boomer generation and, much of to where even our age class, it was very family driven to take those trips from heavily populated areas to the Northwoods, essentially. And as, society has changed, not to pick on it, but if you look at divorce rates and how American families are segmented at this point, like, it's completely different than it was 25 to 40 years ago. And I'm sure that has a huge impact on the way that people are willing to invest time and to do things together. I mean, nobody wants to take, to your point, nobody wants to drive 10 hours by themselves up there to hunt and then shoot one 2 miles from the road and not have any, there's a lot of those things that are playing in that historically, I mean, it was easy to find 7 guys that pile into a truck or whatever and head north and spend the day up there.
Yeah. So our questions, what we want to get into is there anything at all that we can do about it? And we don't know yet, but what if we were somehow just purely hypothetical, able to increase hunting access in a closer to our urban areas, our population centers? Would that would that stem the tide? Would that cause people to come back in? Because now I got to drive half hour. Okay. Maybe.
Yeah, it's appealing.
Or maybe they're not going to hunt anyway because, again, their kids got
time commitment
or whatever. So we don't know. I think the decision of, am I going to continue hunting or am I going to get my kid hunting, is really a bunch of factors that kind of get rolled up into one, and every individual weighs these things different. My kids do youth sports. I've got a 13-year-old, 11-year-old, and a 6-year-old. I'm not going to stop hunting. And if they don't end up wanting to hunt, I'm still going to hunt because that's me. Other people are different, but I'll tell you this, I don't hunt as much as I would have otherwise. Right.
Yeah.
That's just but everyone's calculation's different. But I think all these factors, they're pulling on people at different ways.
Well, mine's in the same boat then. So I've got a 13-year-old as of next month and a 9-year-old, both active in sports. And I think the biggest thing is and maybe I just wasn't that, I played every sport growing up. Whatever the season was, you played it. That's just how it was.
Yeah.
Now it's these kids, if they're in soccer, there's 9 different soccer leagues and travel soccer and all and if they don't do that, good luck making the high school squad. It was never like that. You were just an all-around athlete and you played whatever you had.
It's so much more demanding now.
It's crazy.
I'm blown away. My 6-year-old's going to clinics.
Yeah.
How to, and it's a choice we make. We don't have to do that. Right. But frankly, my 11-year-old, he wants to or do you want to go grouse hunting with me, or do you want to go play baseball with your buddies? He wants to play baseball because it's a game with his friends.
Yeah.
And that's going to be more fun than getting whipped in the face with an aspen branch and whatever else, right?
When Dad should have held it.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, watch out for that.
When Dad's paying attention to where the dog is, and all of a sudden the kids, but that's just the realities, and
it is.
And I think the aggregate of those is the current situation is we're losing hunters. And so again, can we do anything about that? And if we can't, how do we manage deer in that context of declining harvest capacity?
Yeah.
You talked with Jeff about that. You talked with Mike Tonkovich about that. I watched a couple of your episodes, and we're losing deer hunters. We've got deer going like this, hunters going like that. What do you do?
Yeah.
We don't have.
Well, I like where your head is at on it. I mean, I think that's a really rational way to go about it. There's definitely a lot of factors that are, some that are in our control and some that are out of it. I think, Jeremy and I talk about it a lot, obviously, and I think that our general diagnosis of it seems to be related to access first and foremost. It has a lot to do with access, whether it's the driving up north or the half hour away, like the convenience element
Cost
of
of
it,
the listing or buying.
cost, all of that, but also, just the quality of the experience, which I think in some way is tied to the quality of the resource, or the species that lives there, whether it's an age class or a number of them, or but those general correlations seem to exist, and so we feel a general prescription is improve access, improve quality of the resource, and interpret that however you want, whether it's restriction of technologies, lethality of certain, age classes or whatever within the species. We feel that those things are, that's kind of that conversation, but.
Yeah, I think it's
food for thought for your research, Amy.
Well,
not to bias you, but
no, it's interesting, and obviously we'll get to it here at some point when we start talking about like the HDs and the CWDs and all these things. Then like basically a complete clock out of right field that then throws in this whole other factor to now start to consider and how it not saying it in a bad way, but the majority of deer hunters are not that vested in it, right? They do it because it's a pastime, it's a tradition. Maybe they go out for opening couple days with their friend. That's the lion's share of the deer hunter in the woods. And those are probably also the people, and just because they're not vested in it, that are the least educated about all of the factors, things like CWD. And so if all of a sudden they're like, oh, there's this disease and like all these deer and I'm going to shoot a deer and it's going to have it, well, I'm not eating it. And that's really the only reason, like that's a whole compounding factor that starts a domino effect that, 25, 30 years ago wasn't a factor. Didn't happen.
Yeah. The CWD thing adds a whole wrinkle. And I think for some folks, like you said, you're spot on that there's different levels of engagement, and there's the hunters that they're not listening to your podcast, right? They're not like the super passionate. I think those are probably the ones that are less likely to be aware of CWD, or maybe they're aware of it, but like, oh, is it here? Or I test? Like they're not even probably testing.
Yeah, it's not on their radar.
If they're not that aware of it, they're probably not factoring that in as much. I mean, maybe. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's hard to make a blanket sort of statement about that, but it's definitely in your perception of CWD, whether what it's doing to the deer herd and the deer you're seeing, the human health risks, that also impacts people's harvest decisions. And that we don't know, we can't say that's like causing people to drop out necessarily. I mean, probably is on some level if people are just like sick of every deer they shoot is positive and they don't want to eat it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's definitely, it adds another calculation, because again, there's the things that are pushing you away from hunting, and then there's the things that are pulling you towards hunting, and then what wins, and that's different for everybody. And CWD can be one of those things that can kind of push you over the edge for some folks, for
definitely.
sure.
I mean, I guess overall, we're obviously, you've got a loss of hunters here in the state of Wisconsin. Is it been proportional loss in or reduction in harvest, or are people killing more deer than they were? Like what does that look like right now, Dan?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we are getting, despite our losing hunters, we are
stayed the same.
I mean, our harvest isn't as high as it used to be.
Right.
But we've lost a couple 100,000 hunters, right?
Yep.
But on a per hunter basis, especially in our farmland, we are usually killing more deer. Despite losing hunter, this past year we didn't lose hunters, thankfully. We were kind of stable,
stagnant. Yep.
Yeah, but there's in 3 counties we had buck harvest records.
Wow.
Despite having some of these counties having lost maybe 10-20% of the residents that hunt in that county.
Holy cow.
So, why is that? Well, there's a number of reasons, but one of them is because we've got more deer in those areas, in that portion of the state. Our deer factory is like sort of that central Wisconsin. where most of those harvest records, buck harvest, not total harvest.
Yeah, but
we used to shoot more antlerless deer, but buck harvest records. So it's not like, well, for every 1,000 hunters you lose X number of deer killed. It's not that simple because of success rates kind of changing around and stuff. So
yeah. Interesting. Yeah, we always talk about that with states because it seems like, and again, maybe not going back into the time frame when Wisconsin was at whatever 750,000 plus deer hunters, Pennsylvania was at 1 million, but for as this thing has kind of settled down here, it does seem like even with the loss of hunters overall, we're killing at least the same amount of deer, if not sometimes more deer.
Right, but the question is killing how many out of what's the denominator? Like you may be killing a greater number, but that's maybe just because your population's so much bigger.
Right, gotcha.
So so it may like I think Tonk said the same thing. It doesn't necessarily, depending on the context and where you are, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing from the more holistic perspective. So it's subjective, but it may mean because we have so many deer and our hunters are not effectively controlling the deer population, for instance. So,
interesting. So can you explain that again? So you're killing the same number of deer, but now
it's a lower
not
percentage
enough.
of
the overall population.
The harvest. So there's definitely counties where the harvest is like stable, fairly stable, and it bounces around, but more or less long-term stable. But our population estimates, which
the population of deer has grown.
The population's growing up. And so they're actually shooting a lower percentage of the population. And which, if you're a buck hunter, that's good because your buck harvest rates are going down and you're getting more mature bucks.
Yeah, older age class deer.
Right.
And it also, as an aside, that also as hunters see more deer, they're more likely to just, why shoot him? I'm just gonna I've got a good chance of seeing a bigger one come by, so that kind of compounds that selectivity. But then again, from an estate agency perspective, where we want to minimize the car vehicle collisions, the damage, the ag damage, forestry damage, that sort of thing, and try to be able to manage deer sort of more broadly for society, then that kind of, it's not always has been a good situation, right?
HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Deer Grow.
Man, we've been using Deer Grow products for a long time. The Plot Start and Plot Boost, more recently Plot Till. Now we've got 3 new liquid fertilizers that have been put in the mix that will cover everything we could want for a food plot program.
It's huge, man. The more food plotting we do, it's like, man, the liquids just make sense. Like whether it's herbicides or the Plot Start and Plot Boost, and now the fertilizers getting mixed in. It's like, man, I can combine all of those in certain cases and do less passes for more results.
I mean, it's all about efficiency. I mean, like you said, less passes. If you're out there treating your beans with glyphosate in the summertime, you can mix in this fertilizer, do that all at once. You have the boost in there to help some metabolism. It's all about efficiency when we're talking about food plots. And really the big difference on these liquid fertilizers is you're bypassing some of these soil limitations, pH limitations, the soil type. In a lot of cases, we talk about dry fertilizers only being available for 17% of what you put down in the first year. These liquid fertilizers straight into the plant are 90% available in the first year. Huge difference in what you're going to see in growth.
It's huge. And so right now you can use code HUNTR15 for 15% off any of the Deer Grow products on their website. And as always,
better food plots, bigger deer. The thing that I see, and I would assume, again, making assumptions that Wisconsin deer hunters, similar to Pennsylvania deer hunters, just the way that they typically are, with people seeing more deer and populations increasing in these counties, like, do they still have a gripe with the DNR? Like that seems to be the thing for Pennsylvania, right? Back in, before the concurrent buck doe and antler restrictions, guys would see 75 deer on the opening day of deer season. Now, 74 of those would be does and fawns, but regardless, they were like, we saw 75 deer. Now they may see way better quality of bucks, but it's usually the deer numbers that is the complaint. Like what would be your take on people now with like increasing populations in some of those counties?
I think that it can vary the entire gamut.
Sure.
Just obviously, but we are seeing, there are plenty of hunters that recognize the situation, the need to harvest more antlerless deer, the need for like not just them, but like everyone to do it, and saying, hey, we can certainly do it. We have those county deer advisory councils that you talked with Jeff, and they'll meet and decide on the population trend that they want. And so a lot of those have decided they want they want a downward trend. That's their citizen driven objective. The hunters aren't like yelling at us that I hear that we have too many deer there.
Most would not. Yeah.
I don't, and again, Jeff hears it more directly. I don't know that we're getting there's not enough deer. I mean, you do hear that even in these high density counties, because there are people, like, no matter what, like, you can imagine a farm that's got some scattered woodlots and that's just not going to have a lot of deer. That's just not going to necessarily hold a lot of deer. So even if that county has a ton of deer, they don't.
On a localized level, they're like, there are none.
Exactly. And they've got, obviously it's their right to tell us that and such, but I mean, I guess the point is, like, with those CDACs, they'll set an objective. They say, we want this county to have fewer deer next year, but then they can't do it. We can't, because we give away free tags.
Yeah. It doesn't mean people are going to fill them.
They're not going to fill them because they've got their mental sort of limit, their freezer space or whatever that they're after. So the harvest that we get is pretty insensitive in our farmland to how many free tags and how many tags are available. That's our issue. Yeah. And that's Ohio's issue.
I was going to say, it's most issue. Any of the suburban areas, or it's same with Pittsburgh. I mean, they shell out more and more tags every year. We probably kill less of those than we've ever killed. That doesn't equate to killing more deer. Okay, so let's.
It's interesting. I'm just teasing out in my mind here why that might be. You know what I mean? Is it just a,
like why people aren't filling the tags?
Yeah, I mean, not so much an unwillingness, but is it just like a motivation? Is it just does? Is it just like a motivation, or is it retaliation? Like, no, we don't want to shoot.
I mean, I assume people are trying to fill their buck tag, right, Dan? I mean, it's the antlerless tags that are just, you could shell out as many as you want, and they're just not going to do it.
Exactly. And I think, so there is some human dimensions, what we call research here, and they found, I think the number was, on average, hunters, if you average across the hunters they asked, they want to shoot like 1.3 deer or 1.6 deer, or whatever it is. So the hunters, most hunters just don't want to harvest that many deer. They, there's hunters that certainly could. I mean, if you think about a hunter that's, watching the doe parade every time they go out hunting, but they don't want for them, it's not, venison's not a staple for a lot of folks. It's a novelty meat. And so it could be a staple if they chose. That would be better if a lot more folks did that.
Right.
But they don't, right? Which is like the frustrating thing. And of course it's their personal choice, obviously, but like, that's, to me, because we can't regulate our way. We can't make them do right. If in my dream of dreams is we have a somewhat of a shift in our hunting culture, and it doesn't have to be everybody, and it can't be everybody, but those folks that have that doe parade every time they go hunting, that see 20, 40 deer when they go hunting, like, and then they don't shoot a doe, and then on the way home they're like, "Hey, honey, can you pick up a pound of burger so we can make tacos?" It's like, well, you just.
Oh no, I mean, dude, we have the same discussion all the time. It's like the guys who always come to the defense of like, well, like, I'm a meat hunter, and it's like, boy.
Okay, here's a real off the wall proposal that I've never put out there. How do we make deer taste better? Because that's the reason. I mean, you've had steak, right?
Yeah,
venison ain't that.
It's a developed taste more than anything, and it's
just not as good as that developed.
Well, it's because it's not as fatty.
It's because it's not been bred for. Yeah, I mean, steaks are, cattle are bred for that purpose.
And they're grazing on.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's your solution. Figure out how to make does taste better. People shoot the crap out of them.
Tasty does.
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, that is a lot of it, is that people, it's a novelty meat, and for some people it won't be a staple. For a lot of people it is, and if you can teach them how to cook it, like when I was growing up, we'd shoot 1 or 2 deer maybe, and then we would ruin it on the grill, right? Because we didn't know.
Yeah, just overcook the hell out of it and be like, yeah, it's done.
we didn't know. Yeah. We didn't know. So it's snack sticks and ruined meat, and that was it. And then I learned eventually how to cook it, and like, personally, I like it. I know I cooked it for my in-laws who never deer hunted. They every time they come over, they love it. I mean, and for us, I swear, I bet we make 30 pounds of taco meat out of venison. And
absolutely, that's what I was going to say.
The kids don't know.
I mean, right? I survived on that in college. Like just absolutely. Deer tacos, like I don't know, at least 2 or 3 times a week.
Mm-hmm. It's I mean, like I can envision, like, it's possible. It doesn't have to be that. It can't be all the hunters. It wouldn't be all. But if some hunters just said, you know what, I'm going to take this serious. I'm going to be a provider. Like, think about like the, hunters are a tiny minority, right? We do the hunters do what they do based on the blessing of the non-hunting vast majority. How can we make non-hunters who maybe don't care about hunting or think about hunting, like, see it as a social good?
Yeah. Like all the donations that happen for Hunters Feeding the Hungry. I mean, there's tons of families. On a personal level, right? Yeah.
Like, to your coworker, to people at your church, to your kids' parent, your kids' classmates. Hey, you want a package of venison? Yeah. That sort of venison diplomacy. And if they say, like, because currently my fear is, like, the non-hunters are driving around and they're seeing deer everywhere and they're scared to drive in the evening. And then the hunters are saying, well, you need hunting to manage the deer population. If you didn't have hunters, you wouldn't manage you'd be in a terrible spot. We're like, well, actually we have hunters and
we're still in a terrible spot. Yeah.
So, like, what have you done for me lately, guys?
Yeah.
And if hunters can demonstrate their value to the non-hunting society in a couple of ways of having more balanced deer populations, sharing that meat, and like you said, Jared, not everyone likes it, so there's that limitation there. But I think I can see a way forward. I don't know how to get there. It's not something I can, I'm the guy that puts collars on deer, right?
Well, it's a cool take on it, because I don't think I've heard anybody try to tie in the non-hunting public to the solution, right? It's basically been, we've had a lot of discussions, which I do think are valid, around doe-only opportunities, right? Because it's a convenience thing. It's like, if I have the chance, like you said, Dan, like, we don't get to hunt as much as we used to because of the kids. If I get the chance to hunt and I have a valid buck tag, like, that's probably what I'm out there. That's the purpose, at least. I'm not saying I won't shoot a doe, but the purpose is I'm out there trying to pursue a buck. And so, we used to have a doe-only season that was 3 days after the gun season for bucks. And it was a blast, and everybody went, and we killed a ton of antlerless deer because of decreasing hunter numbers and the need to kill as many or more deer. Everything has been concurrent, and it's like, well, we just got to give them opportunity. We talk about this, like, just have a chance whenever they're out, they can kill either. I think in some cases that is good, but I think just the way society from a hunting standpoint has gone, if we had more doe-only opportunities, I think people would participate and harvest does during those timeframes, knowing that they're not missing opportunities at bucks, basically.
Yeah. And we have a doe-only. It's short. We have a doe-only we have a late rifle season in Wisconsin. It starts the Saturday before Wisconsin. Then we have a 4-day doe-only, and then depending on the county, they may have a holiday hunt, doe-only holiday hunt. And it does help, but you go back to that, hey, I only want 1.6 deer, whatever. And dude, I shot my buck, so I don't want 50 pounds of snack sticks, right? Like, so if they don't, so it's really, to me, it's like a culture shift. It's a mindset shift.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It is a culture shift.
And I'm sorry, I say that stuff, and I can imagine the northern Wisconsin hunter getting real mad because they don't have that opportunity, right? And it's not not everybody can do it. The public land hunter, no matter where they are. I mean, it's not. We wouldn't say, hey, please go shoot more does because they don't get the opportunity. But there are people that literally see 40 deer every time they go.
Yeah. Sure. Right?
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's the
so
divide.
If they saw 20, would they really be that less? Would they really be that worse off if they saw 20 a day?
No, not at all.
Or 10 a day. So, but and we're not. It's also not realistic to expect people to just stack doe after doe after doe either. But
it's inconvenient, unfortunately, and lifestyles have to your culture change. It's like people just want convenience, and it's like I don't want to shoot it when it's hot because then I've got to do something with it fast. Post season at some point I'm just like, I kind of shot my deer per what you said. I don't really need to shoot anymore. So it's like it really is a culture shift on the fact that at one point in time, going out and shooting deer was the thing. That's what you did. And sure, everybody wanted to kill a buck, but frankly, most people weren't going to kill a buck. And everybody who didn't kill a buck was for sure trying to kill a doe when the doe season opportunity came around. That's just not what it is anymore. It's just, most people they're buck hunters, and there's nothing to be ashamed about with that. It is what it is. It's just,
I don't know. I'm trying to even think what would motivate me to that the state could do that. I'm like, oh, that would get me to shoot more does type of a thing. Like, we do it out of, for me, it's a management thing. But like, like we were talking earlier, I don't think 90% of hunters are, can have that level of impact on a piece of property or have that just thought. I just don't think that that's happening.
I mean,
it's more it's financially. I'm thinking, can you rebate them like on their buck license for the number of does they incentivize them financially somehow? The extreme end is the earn a buck thing, which everybody hates. But I'm like, it is what it is.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, because I mean, you want another buck, right? If you had the choice to be able to,
or the second buck thing. We talked about that. Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I've thought about the whole like a CRP type thing, except for some sort of financial incentive to do that. And I mean the problem is people just like to see deer. So the guys who are seeing 40 deer, like, I get it. I hunt low deer density areas, and like if I see a handful, I'm like, damn, that was a good hunt. So if I could see 40 deer, it's like that would be an amazing day out in the woods.
Yeah,
and they just have it all the time. And
what if you just made it like, I don't know, I'm crazy here. What about just like over the summer, like just like youth season, just like wide open? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you're just crossing over with fawn recruitment and stuff like that. And
who cares? They're does.
Yeah, but I mean, they're dropping.
Oh yeah, I'm with you from a reproductive standpoint. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is why a lot of people don't like to shoot them late, because they know that most of them are bred and carrying fawns. And that's biologically, if you're overpopulated, who cares? Like, you need to take miles off the ground, but humanely, just the human aspect of it, they don't like that.
What is the method? I mean, we talk, everybody hears about sharpshooters, and what would be the DNR's or the government's method for removing deer without hunter assistance?
Well, in Wisconsin, we haven't had used government calling in what was that? It's been 20 years or something like that. We just don't do it. But that municipalities do it.
Yeah,
but
municipalities.
The DNR doesn't do it, because the DNR had been doing it, but not, to some extent in our CWD areas, like early on. But that went away because it was not popular, and it went away about, I think, even before earn a buck. But earn a buck was more impactful than the sharpshooting. At least in terms of like deer on the ground. I guess my concern is with, and this is not like, I'm just saying, like, I can imagine the bad future is folks are like, hey, the hunters aren't doing it.
Sure.
And we're going to start doing sharpshooting, and it's not restricted to municipalities anymore. It's like, we need these deer killed, and your guys aren't doing it. So Well, we're going to pay for it. Well, and who's paying for it? What is that? What are you not doing if you're having to spend funds shooting deer? And so like, we don't want to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's why people always cry out about the insurance agencies and get it. Like, listen, the insurance companies in areas that have heavy deer populations are not happy about it. Right? Nor is the ag department.
And just be, totally honest. But even you and I view shooting does as work. Like, we justify it by, yes, there's meat there, but on a big property, it's like,
and there's only so many. Like, I don't need 10 of them in my freezer.
The best opportunity that it provides is like, for kids and stuff, if you can get them in, especially if you have a dedicated season, that's perfect. It's like, great, let's bring other people in that don't have the hunting opportunities that I do to shoot does on our property. That's what we do, and it works. But outside of that, and I'm just thinking like, whether it was government fund or however they were organizing this, if I found out that like, oh, they were just gonna, whether it was sharpshooters or whatever on the neighboring property, and they were only gonna shoot does, then I would be like, great, problem solved. Like, they're going to take care of them for me.
Yeah.
We have some Amish neighbors on some properties, and granted, they're shooting bucks too. But if they were only shooting does, we don't shoot does on that property because why?
Yeah, they kill
take care of. Just thinking out loud.
Yeah, no, I get it.
If somebody else is going to come zap away my does, then great. I'm going to shoot one here and there, but
well,
I didn't personally shoot any does this year. We had a lot shot off the farm, but
yeah, it's interesting, and I don't know the bottom facts of it. Like I've seen some of the letters, but I mean, obviously they're still doing a lot of sharpshooting in in Missouri around some of these. Like,
are they still?
Oh yeah. Yep, and they're going.
Who called it off fairly recently because they were like, it's just not doing anything. Wasn't that Wisconsin?
No. So Minnesota, and I want to make sure I'm not misrepresenting things, but Minnesota in their southeast part of their state, that's their kind of their initial CWD. Well, they had been trying to sharpshoot, and they are not in that area anymore. The reason being that they weren't getting enough access to make it worth it. And if I'm remembering right, I think they, on their attempts to get access to a property, they're getting a yes like 10% of the time. And so that the harvest they were able to get just wasn't moving the needle. And so it's just, states got limited resources. So I think what my understanding of what they are doing is reevaluating and seeing, all right, if we're going to see if we think we can get enough access to move the needle.
Yeah,
that's what's happening in Minnesota
well, and good for them, right? I mean, versus just going out there and shooting deer to shoot deer, knowing that it's not going to really have an effect.
Yeah,
like that obviously wouldn't be popular.
And we kind of bridged a gap there of like the doe harvest discussion versus a CWD thing is kind of a different deal.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is. Missouri's been the big one, right? In that it's the number, it's the deer sightings that then, again, a lot of these areas, per what we just talked about, we're used to seeing 40, 50 deer a night when they were sitting and hunting. And now they're seeing 5 or 10. I get it. That said, like, maybe that is more in check with the habitat that was there. Like, maybe they were overpopulated when they were seeing 40 or 50, and like, you shouldn't have had that. They're relating most of that to the sharpshooting. They're saying, hey, because of all of this targeted shooting around my farms, they're killing all the deer. Obviously, things like EHD have come in, and that's a complete different wrinkle into it. But, they're basically saying there's no deer left, right? They're killing all the deer. Now, what I don't know is and again, this is just the social news aspect, is like they're shooting everything, bucks, does, whatever.
Sure.
I don't know that. Like, I don't know if they are just like open-ended, just shooting deer, miles off the ground for testing, or if they are targeting antlerless or anything like that. I assume they're trying to get a representative sample. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. I don't know the particulars of what Missouri is doing, other than I know those folks, they're good professionals. They know they're doing their level best to manage the disease. I don't know the particulars of like you're asking how that works. I'm not sure.
Well, and so Dan, let's get into that conversation, because the reason that Missouri is doing that is that they believe that they do have enough access and that their targeted efforts are, I guess, keeping CWD prevalence rates in check, right? And so maybe just for our audience, and I know this is base level, but, talk about like what is CWD prevalence? Like when we say that, what does that mean to the average guy listening to this?
Yeah, that would be like the proportion of deer that have the disease at a given point in time. And we usually think of it because it varies with age and it varies between bucks and does. So the older you get, the more likely you are to be infected. And then bucks almost always have a higher prevalence than does. But so you might think of the prevalence or the proportion of positives within an age class. And then again, between bucks and does.
Why do we see it higher in the bucks than does? What's the perceived thought process there?
Yeah, and that's a good way to put it. Perceived process. We have to kind of speculate or gain data. We can't, because you can't observe a transmission event, right? So you have to kind of use some reason and some data to sort of suss it out. And we don't know for sure, but it's most likely behavioral. Think about like a doe group, and even in high density areas, I mean, those what we call them, like a matriarchal doe group, where it's does and her offspring and maybe her young offspring from the last year. And they might, when they live in an area, they could overlap completely their home ranges with another matriarchal group. They could feed in the same fields and stuff, but they're not licking each other that often. That's pretty rare. They'll lick within the group, all sorts of grooming and stuff going on, but they're not going to go to some strange doe and lick them and stuff, which again, that's a potential transmission, right? Saliva. Okay. But think about buck bachelor groups. They're super fluid. And they groom one another. They're always licking each other and stuff like that. And then like, okay, I'm with this buck and then I'm leaving and maybe I'm doing the same thing with a different buck over here. So you can see how they're not as cohesive or restrictive in their social behavior. And I think the biggest, but my one of my speculations, and it's not just me, but like a lot of folks are narrowing in on scrapes. Licking branches. If you think, you know what they do at a scrape. They're peeing on the ground. They're peeing on themselves. They're licking and chewing that licking branch. They're snorting at the ground, pawing at the ground. They may be ingesting some of that soil that's got urine and feces on it. Obviously, the saliva. You chew on this licking branch, and the buck comes and chews on licking branch. It's just like an obvious way that could lead to transmission. And all deer do use scrapes to some extent, but obviously bucks are the big ones, right? So those types of behavioral things are most likely, I think, the thought behind how that works.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, because a lot of
makes sense to me.
Yeah, a lot of what you hear from people when we talk about the sharpshooting and stuff is the kickback. Well, what are we going to do? Like, try to eliminate scrapes or do this and that, and it's like. The social behavior is something like as long as deer are on the landscape, like we can't control. We're not gonna. It's gonna happen out there, and so it's a natural occurrence.
It's the mating conversation is where that comes up.
Right.
You're just talking about points of
contact.
Whether it's baiting, and then the rebuttal is always, well, you're not going to stop scrapes, and it's true.
It's true.
It's true.
Yep. But I think where that then comes in is if we talk about the prion aspect of CWD, like there's a certain amount, right, of prion exposure that has to happen, right, Dan?
I think so. It's probably, there's probably like a chance element, right? So like maybe they can ingest some prions. It doesn't necessarily mean they'll get infected, but like the more they do that, the more the amount, the higher the chances, because they're just accumulating risk over time. And these things there's different things they do that are more or less risky, and yeah, that's how I think of it.
Unprotected corn pile behavior.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
And scrapes unprotected.
That's how it happened. Yeah, and I think that's where people like. And again, I'm not the ones that have really. It's a big issue, and unfortunately, in a lot of the whitetail states at this point, right? There's very few that are untouched. The ones untouched probably just haven't found it yet. Like it's there. So, because it's become such an issue, and listen, at the end of the day, whether you believe the science, thought it was real, it doesn't matter. Like the COVID thing did not do any help to CWD research and perception, right? I mean, that prior to that, there was a lot of skepticism about it and what was happening. Post-COVID, it is the analogy, right? I mean, you see it everywhere anymore as like, CWD is nothing more than COVID. And part of, I was reading through some of the results and stuff here, Dan, and we'll get into the details of it, but in some ways it is like it in that like COVID really wasn't killing people, but it was causing other things to kill people, pneumonia being a big one. And I saw in here that you guys, when you were testing a lot of these deer in a necropsy, so finding them post death, that they were positive or had pneumonia.
Mm-hmm. Which, I mean, use your analogy. Like, it's not like what happened at the end of COVID? Like, people just like they stopped dying from it. Like,
think what happened,
beat it at some point.
I think people got infected and they built up enough. There's enough people because there's some amount of immunity you get if you get infected and survive that infection. So that basically, if you think about like the disease trying to jump around to different individuals, well, now all of a sudden an immune individual is not a jumping point. So then that transmission gets broken up.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah,
that's why COVID, because everybody was susceptible at first, right?
Yeah,
nobody had immunity. So right. COVID rates went through the roof, and then there's immunity built up. And then what does COVID do? It keeps evolving. Now we got a new strain. Now your past protection your past immunity, it didn't last, right? Mm-hmm. And immunology is a whole different, and the viruses, that's, prions are not that. And so and viruses work on a much faster time scale. And just the rapidity of which those things can evolve is just like a next level. And so the COVID CWD analogies are, they're not great, but I totally take your point about how people kind of perceive that. I would say though that with, the COVID folks, they die of pneumonia, right? Yep. But the point is, they probably wouldn't have had pneumonia if they didn't have COVID, right?
Right.
That's what it is with CWD. That's what it is with CWD. And so a deer that gets to end stage CWD, they're going to be starving. And they very likely are going to have some kind of infection going on. Pneumonia is a big one. It could have some gastrointestinal kind of infection. And any deer can starve. I mean, if you don't have enough food, you're going to starve, right?
Yeah.
The thing with CWD is it's having these deer starve when they are surrounded by literally, and I mean literally, unlimited food. Mm-hmm. It's not a resource limitation. In northern Wisconsin, in all the Great Lakes states, there is some amount of winter, late or early spring starvation because these deer have just run out of fat reserves before spring greenup can come along and rescue them with good new food. They ran out because during winter, every deer during winter is literally they're starving at a slow rate, right? And if spring comes along to rescue them, then bam, they're good. They can start building up fat reserves. Mm-hmm. That's kind of how the nutritional model of starvation works. That's not what CWD is doing. I mean, like we had deer die of starvation every month, like it doesn't matter, like October, July, August. And so that's why you can say it died, quote unquote, of CWD because it would not have died.
So you guys actually found carcasses of deer that would have died from CWD, right? Because that's the biggest thing. I mean, if you see it, I'm not that person.
But to use that example there, these are deer in enclosure observed not eating. It's that they because of the disease make a choice not to eat, or they are eating and they still are starving.
It's weird. They have to be consuming less on some level. I don't know also though, because I recall having, and I'll get to your question, but like, well, so to jump to the side, yes, we've viewed like dozens and dozens of collared deer that died of CWD, that died of starvation, that died. It's just unthinkable, right? A 4-year-old doe is emaciated in July, and she's got no injuries, she's got nothing else. She just is emaciated, and she had CWD, advanced CWD, right? That we had that happen many, many times with our collared deer. Back to your question, Jared, about are they eating or are they not eating? And I do recall one of these deer, these having starved deer that had a full stomach. So I don't know to what extent that they're ruminant, obviously, and so they've got this whole ecosystem of microbes that help them digest. Obviously, digestion's a complex physiological thing, and maybe the disease just screws that up somehow. I don't know.
So they're just not able to extract nutrients and things like that. Like it's just passing through if they are eating it.
Yeah, and what happens towards the end, like the this end stage where they get real sick looking, it's pretty short, and they just go downhill so dang quick, and their behavior is changing. Everything's changing about them.
Wow.
We caught deer, it happened, I don't know how many times, but we'll catch a deer, and because when we're collaring deer, like most studies, you're collaring them in winter because that's when you can effectively catch them. And you probably are aware of what Pennsylvania Game Commission and the co-op unit have been doing forever, catching deer in winter, collaring them. Okay. So we'll catch a deer, catch an adult doe, and she's 150 pounds, 170 pounds in February. 2 months later, she's 100 pounds and she's dead. She just tipped over and lost almost half her body weight in the space of 2 months. It's incredible. It happens fast, and to all appearances, this is an infected deer that's been infected for more than a year, and it outwardly looks like a beautiful, big, fat Wisconsin doe. 2 months later, we had one. It's so distinct. She was a 170 pound. That's a big doe.
Yeah.
Right. And she died in May. She died around the time we were going to start looking for fawns. She had a mummified fetus. She just totally lost condition to the point where, we're talking literally no body fat. We're talking bone marrow. Bone marrow is the last place that we have fat storage.
Mm-hmm.
And that turns to what they call red jelly. That means it's like all the fat is gone. And then after that, the muscles going away. That's the wasting, just the muscles, and they're just losing everything they've got.
Wow.
So they're just dead.
And so some of these, obviously you're not, we can't test them to say at capturing these deer have CWD, right? It's all post-mortem.
Yes, we do.
You are?
Yeah.
Okay. So
what was the question?
So basically when they're capturing them to put the collar,
you can identify while they're alive. Yeah.
So when you've put that collar on, if that deer is infected or not.
Yes, we do.
How do you test that?
This is where my 13-year-old self is going to start. Like it's a rectal biopsy. So do you guys know, have you heard of this at all?
Rectum damn near killed him.
Are you familiar at all with
this? I had no idea.
Yeah.
Like butts, right?
Like if my teenage self knew that when I'm in my 40s, I'm going to be talking about rectums on a video.
They know you made it at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, the areas in the body that you can access that have the highest concentration of prions are the lymph tissues, right?
Yep.
So you're familiar with those retropharyngeal lymph nodes, which obviously you can't access without killing the deer.
Right.
But in the rectum, there are these like small, like lymph node, like not nodes, not big nodes, but like it's really a bunch of really small ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so we take a biopsy from that, and it's a whole procedure. They actually, because if you've heard of scrapie, that's a similar disease to
sheep.
In sheep. So because of scrapie, there's a commercially made speculum that's made for a sheep's rectum. You insert it, it kind of spreads things out, and there's a little window, and you really delicately take this fine kind of tweezers. You lift it because it's all like folded.
Yeah.
You lift it, you make some little snips, and you have this tiny piece, maybe the size of a penny or smaller. And then we put it in a little cassette and formalin, and then it gets shipped off to a laboratory that does the testing.
Wow.
And
interesting.
Yeah, that's how we do it. And so we have an indication of their infection status at capture. And that you can have a deer that tests negative at capture
Mm-hmm.
and then dies with CWD because
Yeah.
they can get it in that intervening period of time.
Did you have any the other way? Like, were there any false positives? No.
False negatives?
Or false negatives?
Yeah. Well, false positives are what you're saying.
Yeah, like when you were...
Oh, it tested positive, but it wasn't. No.
Wow.
Those tests, the tests that we use, like, doesn't happen really, I guess, but the false negatives, meaning it really had the disease and you missed it.
Yep.
That does happen in that rectal biopsy sometimes. But there's been a study that published the rate. And so then we actually incorporate that information to our analysis to say, okay, we had so many deer that tested positive at capture and so many deer that tested negative at capture, but we know that some portion of those negatives were actually positive. So,
yeah.
So, okay, well that changes a lot of my thought process on questions.
What is the read on that? What does it just say, positive or negative, or is it more complex than that?
What we get back, what we get back is a positive and negative, and that's what, as the diagnosticians at the lab, they do their thing, and that's lab stuff.
Yeah, there's probably different markers or whatever that are triggered off there that lead to that.
Yeah, in the same, it's the kind of lab technique is the same. That's called an assay, like the test for the disease, and it's the same that's used on lymph nodes as well. It just happens to be less sensitive on the rectums because there's less of that tissue.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so I guess just looking at some of the, call it, popular thought processes out there and stuff are, a lot of these deer that are contracting it or living 18 months, 24 months, etc. Have you guys been able to now, since you were able to test some of these and say, hey, this one didn't have it and then it did have it at death or something, does that seem still accurate from a wild free ranging side from a timeline standpoint?
Yes. I don't think we've seen it, and I don't think we've seen it where it's like longer than that. We haven't had a case where it tested positive at capture and then it lived like 3 years. Like, we haven't seen that.
Yeah.
So in that sense, that has borne out. But of course, we never know. You never know the day it was infected. It's impossible to know that unless you infect it yourself. That's how they know that 18 months is because that's from studies on captive deer where they were inoculating the deer. That's how they know that. But for us in the field, we can't know it. We can only know, like, here's the date it was tested.
Right.
Here is its test status. And the power of this is, like, we're trying to get the live test, the before death test, and the death test. So you can sort of see that transition even from uninfected to infected. So,
Okay. So
that's pretty damning.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so the biggest thing, and again, I think we all are smart enough to know that it's bullshit, but it's like they've never found a deer that has died from CWD. Clearly, Incorrect.
I found many of them.
You found many of them. They're there.
It happens all the time.
Yeah.
But it's just like it's how the and maybe I'm part of the because it's back to how we were talking about. Well, it died of starvation, or it died of right, and it's got holes in its brain, man. Like that's why it starved to death.
Yeah.
Right. So like that's maybe a semantics thing. Yeah,
but that's sorry, not to interrupt you, Dan, but that's no different than the EHD side, right? Because it's the same thing with EHD or blue tongue that a lot of people will say, well, yeah, but look at all these deer died. Most of them had some, hemorrhage or pneumonia or whatever, something else developed and actually like killed that animal.
That's how almost all diseases work. Sometimes it's the immune response that kills you sometimes.
Yeah.
So there's a thing that why I like to talk about it, or say, well, these deer, they died of starvation, they died of pneumonia or whatever, because I get this question of, well, how many deer die of CWD?
Yeah,
and which is totally like an obvious question, but it's the wrong question in my opinion.
Okay,
because that's not the question. It's how much faster do they die than the ones that don't have it? Because what if they never died of CWD, but the disease caused them to get hit by cars at a much higher rate because they weren't aware? Or what if make it an absurd analogy? What if for whatever reason aliens wanted to abduct CWD positive deer and they removed them from the landscape?
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that necessarily that they're dying of CWD. What matters is, how does CWD increase the mortality rate? How does it reduce the survival rate? Now, it so happens that we see deer where it's just like, yeah, it had CWD and it reached end stage and it died.
Yep.
So I just try to orient folks to that. And that's why when we did our results, we were like, okay, we focus on that survival rate comparison, that a deer that didn't, like adult does that didn't have CWD, had a 83% survival rate, annual survival rate on average. And then deer with the adult does with CWD had an average survival rate of like 41%.
The HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Lone Wolf Custom Gear.
Man, Jared, we are tree stand fanatics, and I think the one thing that we have learned over all these years is to kill big bucks, we got to be mobile. We've been hunting out of Lone Wolves for many years, the original Lone Wolf, and then obviously with the custom gear stuff, we were using the 0.5 and the 0.75. Yeah. And the one thing that we talked about is like, what if there were no cables? Here we are.
I really just don't know how you can beat it, frankly. But, a lot of that came too from a relationship that we've built with the DeQuistos. We've had both Cody and Andre on the podcast a few times. The passion for hunting, the outlook on the sport and stuff, I think is eye to eye with how we look at it. Everything that has gone into building this brand and to building these tree stands is something that we want to be a part of.
This is the 40th anniversary of these guys creating tree stands that have been critical to how we hunt whitetail deer today. If you look over the past, you'll see Andre's designs being implemented across so many stands over the years. Such a cool thing, but really has changed the way that we all hunt whitetail deer from above now.
Right now, you can use code HUNTR, HUNTR, to get 7% off anything on the entire website. Be the Lone Wolf.
If we back up a little bit on the end stage and these deer dying from CWD, wasting, whatever would be, would it be accurate to say that just most deer with CWD just never reach end stage because of other mortalities?
I would say that most. It depends on the competing sources of mortality. So with bucks, that's probably true
because of hunting.
Because of hunting.
Yeah.
Right. With does, no.
Okay. So I think that's a good point to know.
Like that's a choice in a sense that folks are making, right? If we had higher harvest rates on does, then
the answer may be yes at that point.
Right. So it depends. So your answer, like if you think about where CWD is in different parts of the country, it depends on what else is going on.
Yeah.
You never look at CWD in isolation.
Yeah.
You look at it in context of what the other factors are.
Well, that's because if we get a bunch of them, but like I'll have a lot of people that will send me and they'll be like, hey, I got shot this buck, it tested positive for C, and I mean it looks It looks fine, right? Like that's the comment, right? It looks normal. Like I would have never known. Yeah, and so I think that and this isn't saying anything bad about the hunting community even. It's just there's for whatever reason, it's very hard for them to put those dots together to understand that deer had CWD. It looked normal. You killed it. Maybe that was just like, it was a natural harvest. But because of the way that CWD, and maybe I'll ask you to elaborate on this, affects the neurological system in the brain, that deer might have been more vulnerable to being harvested as well. Correct?
Might have been. We haven't yet.
Yet being a key word, like it's going to be looked at.
Yes. Oh well, that's the plan, because so we compared overall survival rates, and like that was difficult, and then you kind of partition that. Well, the mortality side, like partition that in different causes, and then you want to compare the uninfected and the infected. We just haven't gotten there yet to really be able to get that good comparison. And that's very important. And that's kind of it's like, okay, we got the main headline, and the most important thing when you're thinking about like, how does it affect populations, is that survival rate difference. But then those nuanced things like you're talking about are extremely important. We're just not there yet.
So, I mean,
but it must be though.
If we look at your results, you mentioned the female side of it, but like on the buck side of it, it's 69% when uninfected, 17% when infected.
Survival rate.
So, I mean,
it has to be in a sense, but we haven't literally done the statistics in the right way to definitively answer it. But 17%'s tiny. So
so that
has to be.
Well, and I guess if you look at that, so think about it on a broader scale, because people like to kill bucks and stuff. But I mean, clearly it's like it's a control and an experiment, right? I mean, that's what we're kind of looking at here when we look at an uninfected and an infected individual. Like, something is making the infected individuals die and not survive. And maybe it is vulnerabilities because of their behavior or something like that, or maybe it's end stage in some cases. But
Okay, yes, and given that there's number one cause of death is hunting in infected deer. Yeah, then it has to be that they're more vulnerable. That just has to be the case. We just haven't, I'm a scientist, so I have to be like.
I completely get it. I'm just saying, trying to make sure that people understand, like, unlike a COVID, because that becomes the analogy. Like, this is a neurological. It affects the brain. There's holes in the brain, right? It's TSC. Like, if anybody has ever seen, the football side of TSC, right, and what that causes people to do from multiple hits to the head and over time. And it's a huge conversation on that end, right? It affected behavior of humans.
Is that what it's called? TSC?
Well, TSC are the transmissible. So CTE. And in Alzheimer's Alzheimer's, which is, I think, kind of does maybe somewhat similar things. It's just not.
Yeah, it's not.
You can't spread it, right? You can't spread it like TSE,
like a TSE from a deer side. Mm-hmm.
But neurologically, there's probably a lot of similarities there.
Yeah, both affecting the brain.
Yeah,
and likely both having behavior changes. I mean, it's your brain.
One other thing that we're doing now, and it's a paper we should submit here this spring, is looking at how their movement characteristics differ. So I in comparing positive and negative deer, and there was a mule deer study that did that, and they found, it's
gotta be right.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is, like I told you, like the body condition changes happen fairly late, like the last couple months or so, but the movement rate changes happen first. So it's this very interesting kind of cascade in even 6 months prior to death, because you can this deer died on this date. It had CWD. It was an end stage CWD deer. Let's look at its prior 6 months movement. And then let's compare a deer that was a deer that was alive during that exact same time span. That's also like a buck of the same age or a doe of the same age. So it's a legit comparison. And let's compare those two.
Yeah, what
and
they
we
do
did
differently.
that over and over again. And we found, when we found that there are some changes to their movement. Principally, they just don't move as much.
The infected ones don't move as much?
The infected ones, just in terms of like what we could detect with our GPS collars. So yeah, there's these changes don't all happen at once. Like initially, it probably doesn't do anything, right? At some point, there has to just accumulate enough in various parts of the body, especially the brain, to start changing things. So what we're doing is we're trying to, we're all learning about how that all proceeds.
Yeah, it'll be interesting because, you go back to the hunting side of things. So, and I don't know what the significance of it is, but like, let's say those bucks and those infected deer, period, just don't move as much. Well, then you probably aren't going to see them as much. And that's how you perceive how the quality of your deer hunt is. Did I see something or not? Right? Like that. Yeah. I'm just saying as an example, like that's a domino effect that could come off of something like that. Yeah,
it could, or it could make a buck more predictable and more killable, or like you said, less wary. Who knows? I don't know exactly. Like you said, it's probably increasing their susceptibility to harvest. Exactly how could happen a few different ways, but yeah, I can see how that might lead to fewer sightings. It makes sense. I hadn't really thought of that though.
Is it affecting? It's interesting to like how this contrasts with our earlier conversation about like we're seeing increasing like population numbers like in some of these counties. I assume some of them are CWD.
Not really in our highest CWD counties. Now we're talking about they seem to be more, for the most part, more like leveling off, if not maybe declining. It kind of depends. The impacts of CWD are always going to be more local than on a management unit. That's just how it always works, right? But
I guess that's my question. Now, are we seeing population decline because of CWD?
Locally, and we don't like. I don't have like when we put our survival rate information together with our recruitment data.
Mm-hmm.
And you put that into a population model, then you say, okay, well, if that's the case, so like you have your survival of your uninfected does and your survival of your infected does.
Yep.
And then the average of those, which depends on your prevalence, determines like your population level average doe survival.
Mm-hmm.
Combine that with your recruitment, that gives you population growth rate. So we say, okay, if we do that exercise, that shows us that when CWD prevalence in adult females is like 30-ish%, that's when we should expect we could see population declines, and those declines would be more rapid the higher the prevalence is.
Right.
So, but CWD prevalence, even in these areas that we've had CWD for 20 plus years, the prevalence varies pretty like fine scale, like as in you drive down the road and the prevalence might not be as high as over here. And so I'm pretty confident that we're seeing local effects. Partly I say that again because I'm not counting deer on a watershed level or a township level. We do that on a deer management unit level, which is not the best way to track these changes, but we hear all the time, I'm seeing less deer. It's a common refrain now. And some folks attribute it to CWD, and some folks want to attribute it to other things that are probably not as likely.
Sure.
But we feel that CWD is the most likely culprit if you're in a high prevalence area and you're seeing fewer deer. Yeah, it's CWD most likely.
So in those high prevalent, are we seeing prevalence rates increase in those high areas? Like if we look back at the last 10 or 15 years here, of testing and monitoring, are we seeing prevalence increase, or have we hit a little stochastic stability? Like what are we looking at there?
Yeah. So going back to when we first detected CWD, it was a pretty low level, and it stayed low for a long time. Then it went to a phase of rapid increase, And now in the last 5+ years, the prevalences that we're seeing in our high prevalence areas are sort of stabilized. Maybe if you squint enough in some of the areas, you might see your prevalences maybe even declining a little bit. But yeah, it seems to, it kind of did this slow growth, rapid rise, level off. That's what we seem to be seeing in these areas.
And we're not really doing any active like CWD management in those areas, are we?
The management, we don't have any harvest prescriptions that can move the needle.
Yep.
As we've already discussed.
Yep.
So it's a lot about trying to have like good, best management practices. Okay, like put your carcass in a dumpster, that sort of thing. Not having baiting, talking about carcass movement restrictions. So it's those sort of things. How much do those move the needle?
Sure.
But that's what we can do. So that's sort of like, if you leave it to its own devices, I mean, when I say that, I mean like,
yeah,
the harvest regulation that we aren't forcing a high harvest because we can't.
Yep.
This is what you get.
Yep. This is it. This is the end result of it. Well, right now.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the future is going to continue, and we don't know if prevalence is going to again stay at a high level, and therefore continue downward pressure on that deer population, or will the prevalence actually decrease? We don't know that. We don't know that yet.
Because you guys did document, and I always refer to this wrong, but like the allele or whatever that's supposed to be the CWD resistance allele or whatever. You've documented that in the wild herd in Wisconsin, right?
Yes, and all of our deer that we collared had that test, and then there's been other work on just like from our surveillance. So, that's another thing that we want to incorporate in the future is, okay, how do these different resistant, quote unquote, resistant versus susceptible genotypes differ in their survival?
Yeah.
We haven't gotten there yet, but that's another bit. What has happened is that so-called resistant genotype is increased in how common it is in these high prevalence areas, because that can only happen if CWD is causing like what they call selective pressure. So that means that
it's natural selection.
Yeah. So the deer that are less have the non-resistant genotype, they're dying faster than the ones that do have the resistant genotype, and so they're becoming less common.
Right.
That's happened. That's happened in Wisconsin.
And some of the
ramifications of that, we don't know.
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, the discussions that we've had around it, and we had Dr. Chris Seabury on here to talk about his side of it, and the fact that those deer with that allele still are susceptible to the disease. Correct. Right. They still can get CWD, and so some of the, I won't say like the resistance against it, because it's naturally occurring. It's going to happen. Is if these deer can live longer, they also can shed the prion for a longer period of time, which is not good in the environment side of things.
That's right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. We need to go back to that conversation because that's not the way I remember it. I'm pretty
You're saying that you're remembering it as he's saying if they have that, they don't get it. Mm-hmm. That's not the case.
Well, but look, I'm not a geneticist. I'm not a biologist. and I don't want to put, I don't want to put words in Dr. Seabury's mouth or whatever, but like, I think he's thinking what he's doing is not just that single genotype. He's like looking at like a broader spectrum.
He told us it was.
Although in terms of like a deer that is literally not able to be infected, I'm not aware of that. Yeah. I'm not aware that exists. And maybe he said that. Maybe he said it. I don't know.
I know. And we'd have to go back and listen to that conversation. And because he was adamant about, and maybe it wasn't they don't get infected, but their rate of infection was much lower. It definitely, because you and I were like arguing about that, and he's like, no. Mm-hmm. And he clarified it there for us.
Well, I think his was around they're healthier, so whether it takes more prion reaction, interaction to have it, and or they're able to survive longer. Which again, I mean, what's the average lifespan of a buck in North America anyways? It's probably 3.5 years old, maybe,
Right.
like or less,
maybe.
right? So, I mean, if end stage exceeds the way that we're currently hunting and managing whitetails, then I won't say that it's irrelevant because it could have population effects from an antlerless or from a doe side, but from a are we going to always be shooting 2.5-year-old bucks and younger? Then no, because they can just survive till they're 6 years old or whatever, hypothetically.
Right.
And I think that was the discussion that I was teasing out of it. But
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say it is interesting that I think a big fear for all of us type hunters is that we hear about prevalence rates and the increase and Wisconsin has got the biggest data set here, right? To look at it from a whitetail side and say, for the last 5 years we're kind of we had a big growth and now we're flat out on this. And so some of these areas that it's been 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, whatever, it's are they about to anticipate or are management actions that they're doing going to prevent that? I don't know.
Well, that's the hope. And I mean, it's in terms of can you increase harvest and therefore slow the spread of the disease? I think most folks that work on this say, yeah, that A makes sense and B seems to be the evidence. There's some work out of Illinois because Illinois used to do a lot of sharp. They do a lot of sharp shooting, and there's some published papers that show that it matters. There's some work that I'm aware of that's not yet published, unfortunately, but it will be, that's showing that the high harvest that we had early on when we instituted earn a buck, that was effective at slowing the spread. And then we stopped doing that and we had a rapid population increase and then a rapid prevalence increase. Now I'm not usually a fan of just let's just look at the data and compare the patterns visually, but you can do that. I mean, and it's pretty plain to me. You can look at this data is all on our website, but you can look at our antlerless harvest and how that was really high. We were shooting 6 to 7 does per square mile when we had earn a buck in Iowa County, and then we stopped earn a buck, and then that dropped to half, probably, antlerless harvest.
Wow.
And you can look at that. Then you can look at our population estimates, and that antlerless harvest dropped dramatically. Our population estimates, our population was growing at a pretty rapid clip for a while.
And
then you look at our prevalence, and our prevalence was really rapidly increasing at the same time that the population was increasing.
Yep.
And now we're at the stage of high prevalence, low harvest deer populations that are stable to decreasing, right? So we traded high harvest for CWD. Not the best trade-off necessarily, but that seems to be what we.
But from a trend base, I mean, that's what you guys are seeing.
Why did you guys stop the earn a buck?
So earn a buck was stopped by the legislature. So we literally can't.
Because people didn't like it.
Because it was very unpopular.
Interesting.
Extremely unpopular.
Did people just think that you were shooting all the deer, you're killing everything?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing about, earn a buck on a unit level was pretty effective, but it wasn't on a broad scale for the most part, causing big declines. But I think one of the issues with earn a buck is that, let's say you're on a property, let's say you got 200 acres and you got 10 hunters. Everyone's got to shoot a doe if they want to shoot a buck. That means you're trying to kill 10 does on 200 acres. Let's say down the road you've got 200 acres with 2 hunters.
Yep.
They're gonna kill 2 does. Who cares? That doesn't matter. So earn a buck has this, when you have these differences in hunter densities, it really kind of because of course, if they kill 10 does on 200 acres every year, Yeah, they're not going to like that. That's going to cause them to shoot more deer than anyone.
Which is traditionally like, and that's how Wisconsin, it was Pennsylvania, Michigan. I mean, that's what you did. If you had access to a 200-acre parcel, unlike now where maybe it's just you and another person, it was 10 or 12 guys, right? Like that you just, every corner of the field was peppered with an orange suit.
Why couldn't you do that on a parcel basis instead of on a hunter basis? Like, why couldn't you just say, hey, like, here's, there's tax data, right? Why couldn't you just say, hey, okay, here's a 40-acre piece of property. This needs a doe shot off of it. And then when somebody checks their doe, just they assign it to say, where'd you shoot it? And there you go. That one's taken care of.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I'm not sure Wisconsin could implement that regardless but that's actually
Yeah, I mean the technology is easy to do it. Everybody with a click of Onyx, Spartan Forge, Hunt Stand, whatever, it's like there's your parcel number. There it is.
Yeah, and we for
there we go.
Harvest,
the code.
For our CWD sampling, you put your location of your sample if you submit a sample to the quarter section. So it's pretty fun.
So it's pretty
yeah.
And the more refined the data for you guys as researchers, heck, if you could look at it as a harvest per parcel basis, it's like, whoa. And obviously there's some level of truth happening in that, but that would be, especially because, so back up a little bit, you were talking about, you could drive down the road and see higher prevalence, which is interesting because I think people, that's where like, obviously from an EHD side, not to confuse people on those, but very, very localized. Farm across the road got smoked. Your farm, not a deer untouched. Now, given those deer are still moving across the road, right? But from like an actual standpoint of when you're testing those prevalence rates, and to your point, doe group interactions and stuff are going to be pretty tight on their home ranges. You're seeing differences, and I would assume, like, can we call it significant differences?
In prevalence variation? Yeah, I think so. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. You need the right kind of fancy statistical modeling to be able to test that, to do that stuff. But yeah, when you do that, yeah.
Because my head triggers to, is there, and again, I know you don't have this data, but is there a commonality between the properties that have lower prevalence versus the ones with higher? Like, is there something landscape level that's happening there? Or? Yeah, I don't know.
That's it. Right. Is it soils? Because there's some interactions. Is it landscape? Is it deer density? And my PhD work was trying to determine why there was that local variation. It was somewhat successful, not that successful.
Too many variables, I would assume.
So many variables, hard to measure the right things at the right scales.
Yeah.
It's a really tough nut to crack because you can get,
you've got my mind reeling though about like that parcel data. Like, man, like as we're trending towards digital check processes where most of that's happening on phone applications now, like how hard would it be for the state to integrate their software with like a land ID or like a...
it's all public data. It's already out there.
Do you know what I mean? And so like if it was as simple as like when I'm checking my deer, it's just like, hey, where did you shoot this deer? And then it's just like, here's a map and I could just zoom in or jump to it with my address and then click the property.
People just don't want to give that data though.
Yeah, maybe not.
But I agree. I think it would be extremely helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, so Dan, there also was a predator aspect to this study too, right? It was like, this is kind of like the mother of all studies here from a GPS collar standpoint. And I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, I was paraphrasing through some things even from the popular side. Did you guys find that there was some like, I guess, avoidance from predators on some of these infected carcasses?
I wouldn't say that. No,
okay.
I don't. I'm trying to think where that might have come from.
I've seen it somewhere that it was like somebody basically said that if there was an infected deer that had died or whatever, a carcass, that it wasn't scavenged upon.
Well, they definitely do get scavenged upon. And we, although from our study, we were removing them
because you were getting to them quick, right? It sends off a mortality signal pretty quick, right?
Yeah. So yeah, it'll send off a mortality signal when the collar's been motionless for like 6 hours. And so then we get there as soon as we can, getting property permissions, because almost all this work is private property work. And yeah, we're there as soon as we can. And then if the deer was intact, we would actually take it to the University of Wisconsin, and in a professional, like a veterinary pathologist would do
the necropsy.
Yeah. And they give you 4-page report or more on all the down low of what was wrong with this deer.
Yeah.
Let me list it in the most, but I'm trying to think I'm trying to think where that might have come from.
I mean, was there any
one thing
okay.
I wonder if it was this, because you may have heard me say, so when we were starting this study, I had some expectations going in about what we would find.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for instance, I thought that our coyotes were really going to mop up on these infected deer
because they were weak, and
because they're stumbling around and weak and vulnerable, because we know that coyotes are, and we know from our northern studies that vulnerable deer, like it's all about how vulnerable an individual is.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you have a deer in the north, say an 10-month-old deer, it's in rough shape. It's easy pickings for a coyote. Well,
for sure.
Why wouldn't that be the case for an infected deer? It just didn't seem to be the case. I mean, it happened. But I thought,
but not all the time.
Not all the time. I thought they'd really clean up, and they just didn't. So maybe that's what you're at.
And no wolves in this area.
There's no wolves in that area. No.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it would be. Well, I mean, I guess on the predator side and CWD aside, were there any surprises, like from a predation standpoint, even with the fawns or anything like that stood out? Or again, I don't know if you've looked at it, but potentially, like if a doe was infected with fawns, was she unable to like mother, appropriately or effectively?
So that latter point, we really weren't able to.
I don't know how you would. I guess
you'd have to. If we had designed our study differently, where we were making a greater concerted effort to collar the fawns of each individual doe, I guess that would have been more expensive.
And you weren't difficult. Right? You were just tracking with VITs when they had fawns?
So a lot of our fawn capture was more just opportunistic.
Okay.
Right? We just get a whole bunch of people and search for, so we're not even trying. We did use some of those VITs a little bit, but then what we ended up doing to varying success was looking at those GPS locations and saying, okay, she really localized last night. So every morning, at 6 a.m, we're going to go and log in and look at our locations, and look at her. She really localized right here. Let's go in and try to find that fawn. And that worked okay, but not enough to build the full sample size to be able to say, okay, infected does were this much worse at raising a fawn.
Well, I guess that was my kind of going on the population trend question, is like, if we're looking at female survivability, it's like, is there also an effect on recruitment because of her condition as, a mother?
I'll say this, that we didn't get that many fawn starvations.
Interesting.
And you do other places. If the mom's not able to feed,
she stops producing milk, and
and that's going to happen. Of course, that can happen, and then it gets killed by a coyote also, and you can't necessarily tell. But we just didn't have that happen very often. So again, it has to be like with respect to CWD, that has to intersect, like their stage of CWD has to intersect when they're giving birth to have that effect. So the question is, how often does that happen? I'm not sure. I mean, fawns, we kind of sometimes overrate the recruitment aspect because fawns are born to die, right?
Yes, they are.
And with respect to like our predation, like coyotes by far our number one predator on fawns, no surprise. But we still had, greater than 50% of our fawns make it to fall, right? That's just that's nothing. That's neither great nor bad. That's just kind of average.
Well, and I mean, that's the reason that most people, even on a CWD front, are like, listen, it's never going to wipe out the deer population. I mean, the reproduction rate and the recruitment rate is going to always exceed the death rate from a CWD. Now, other factors coming in and compounding that, I don't know.
Well, so currently, again, if we have a prevalence of over 30%, we would say that deaths are exceeding births, and it is going down, right?
Okay.
But it's the long term, right?
Yeah.
So like as a deer population declines, what happens is there's more resources for those deer that are left over, though their recruitment should go up. That should buffer us. That's our expectation. That should happen.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't, and I agree that I don't think CW is going to cause any even local extinctions.
Yep.
We haven't seen it in Wyoming, and they have a less productive deer than we do.
Yeah.
And they've had it for a long time, and yeah, they've got far fewer deer than they used to, and far fewer deer than they would otherwise.
Yep.
But they're not gone, and I don't expect them to be gone here either.
Is this like concentrated area? Is it predominantly farmland?
It's just complete mix farmland, forest. It's like if you were to look at the map, I encourage you to go to Google Maps and look at Iowa County, Richland County.
Yep.
It's like someone designed that landscape for deer.
Yeah.
Because you got these woods and fields kind of like doing this.
Yeah,
like
just
fingers,
perfect
right?
finger
It's just this interspersion of habitat types that's just ideal for deer. Yeah.
One of the things that we've talked about on here, not to be the foil hat guy, but it definitely is of question is, and it's observational at this point, but in a lot of the larger ag areas in Illinois and North Dakota, some in Iowa, even after some of these, after an EHD event or something happens to where what we just talked about, the deer that survive have more resources, you would expect recruitment and things to basically at least stay the same, if not increase. It doesn't seem like they're bouncing back. And, part of the discussion there, because you have to anymore, is, with all these being big ag areas, is it something in the chemicals that are being sprayed? Is our chemicals having an effect? And, one of my buddies, do you know Eric Mitchell at all?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
Yep. So yeah. Eric and I are good buddies. He's now one of the assistant professors at the MSU Deer Lab, which is awesome. Mm-hmm. And, Eric looked at basically the neonicotinoid or chemical, inclusion in spleens and stuff from fawns, and essentially, they affect the reproductive organs of fawns. And so the question becomes is is this affecting reproductive? And I only say that because, if CWD just keeps doing what it's doing, and maybe it's not, but if a compounding factor comes in, that's when trouble happens. Like if all of a sudden something like that does affect fertility and recruitment, then yeah, maybe it does lead to deer going off of the landscape.
I mean, I still think going off the landscape is unlikely, but yeah, you never know what's going to come down the pike, and that the neonic stuff is really interesting. And I know that I recall Eric working on that. I should look up that work to see, because that's obviously worth anything that's going to affect recruitment. It's definitely worth understanding for sure.
Yeah, I mean that's the baseline, right? If we can't recruit individuals into the next cohort or year, we're in trouble. Yeah. So yeah, it's really cool, man. I mean, I think that you guys have this has been really cool for us. I think. I mean, there's a lot of information here. It's the first time that I'm, I feel like we're hearing numbers.
Yeah. Well, and you've spoken the most, be confident, the best statistics here of there's, I can't name them. I mean, I would throw out a Ted Nugent, people that I know are pretty outwardly spoken against, not to say it's not real, but basically it's there's a lot of pushback against the disease. And we're we don't know, what I mean? We're well, yeah, we don't know, basically. And so,
because there's never really been good data, numbers to say,
And I'm like, why? I just don't understand that. I mean, what do you see, Dan, as far as like, things that are said in the public that would like dispute, say, hey, deer aren't dying of CWD? I mean, are you seeing that being said? And then how would you diagnose, I mean, where's the disconnect?
What I hear is that question of, well, what do you ever see deer die at quote unquote of CWD? That's the thing that I hear.
And the answer is yes now, right?
And the answer is yes, but also the answer was yes before we collared deer, because we got these deer. I mean, you have this happens where you got this deer who's totally emaciated, drooling and stumbling all over the place in someone's backyard or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then they had CWD. The objection there is, well, you shot it first. Because that's usually what happens is like, well, it's stumbling around someone's backyard.
Yeah, it had to die somehow. What do you do? Just stare at it?
Yeah, so like, I guess you could let it go and watched it, but I guess that's maybe was the objection. Fine.
Who not to call anybody out, but who are some of those guys?
Well, I mean, I talk to them all the time.
Is Kroll one of them?
Jay Gregory is one. Kroll is another one.
They are.
Yep.
And do you know what the argument is there?
Well, I mean, a lot of it now is that EHD is a bigger issue.
Sure. Which in the short term, I would agree.
Like on a localized level.
Yeah.
I think it's, now because of Doge, it's wasteful spending on testing and the millions of dollars. And I guess this is kind of where I'm going with the question is what do we do, Dan? Like, here we are. Right? Like that's the question now. And I don't know if those guys are necessary. They're more of like, just stop doing anything. But I'm more of the side of like,
in terms of like
testing,
prescribed
research,
testing,
funding,
even?
everything. Yeah, just stop. It's not a big deal. That's their position, and take it for what it's worth. But I think the position for most of us who are like, okay, this is a thing. It is serious. I don't know how serious, and also I don't know what we can do about it. Like, what can we do about it?
So what you do about it depends on where you are and what your status is. I think if you are in an area with, say, the CWD has not been detected or it's at low levels, that's where you can have the most impact, right? So you want to, if you're at low levels of CWD, you want to keep it low. How do you keep it low? You have a more robust antlerless harvest, especially, than you probably do now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it depends on where you are.
Yeah.
That's why Missouri is doing the sharpshooting, and that is to enhance that removal of deer. And the reason is pretty simple. Think about, again, these deer, maybe they have infection. They're infected for like 18 months. Every day they're infected, they're shedding prions, and that prion load goes up that they're shedding. But every day they've got a chance to infect another deer, right? For the disease to grow, on average, those infected deer have to infect more than one deer. That's how the disease grows. So they got a chance every day to infect another deer. How do you reduce their chances of passing on the disease? You give them fewer days.
Mm-hmm. Take them out.
You take them out first. So you just have to, on average, and we can't say, oh, that's the sick one, let's shoot.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Do you ever see that being an opportunity in the future?
No.
Yeah. Because most of us can't even count the number of points for an antler point restriction. So odds of us telling that one's infected versus another.
I wonder if that's my head earlier was like, if you could find some way to create like, I don't know, a dye that would correspond with like a genetic makeup and just feed it to all of them. And if one of them is like, it triggers a thing. Oh, there's a green one.
Well, I mean, I would say clearly like an emaciated deer doing suspected at that point too late. Like it's already done. It's like you could take it out, but it's already done its damage.
Probably.
Yeah.
That's why you just raise the level of mortality, or you shorten that average, shorten those opportunities. That's why we do it. That's why it works. That's why we probably sound like a broken record. Well, what do you do about it? You harvest more deer, and that's probably annoying to folks because it's like that's our one note that we play, but that's why it's just it's what happens. It works.
Well, a lot of guys though, and Tonk and Sumners know that I argue with them on this, so they'll be fine with it. But those guys are of the mindset that the future is a very young age structure of bucks. I mean, do you think that if we simply increase antlerless harvest but still practice, I don't know, good age structure management on bucks, like, is that still a possibility for the future, or are we going to end up saying like killing bucks at a more frequent rate as well?
Honestly, having a higher rate on both is the best.
Right.
But what's the question that we don't really know the answer to, I don't think quite yet, is what is that rate? That's the important thing. Because if you can, so like, it doesn't have to be all of them necessarily to have a positive effect on reducing the growth and prevalence. So then, say if you harvest 40%, I'm just throwing out a number. Say you harvest 40% of your bucks every year, and that's effective. Is that bad? I mean, that's from a trophy perspective. You'd rather that you have a lower harvest rate, but 40% is still going to give you a lot of trophy opportunity.
Well, and again, I don't know what it is right now, but like, in Wisconsin, what's the average age of a buck harvested anyways? 2.5, maybe 3.5.
Yeah, good question. I don't know like the average age, but I mean,
but you know what I mean? They're not. It's not like everybody's selective for a 4 and 5 year old. So we're just passing up all these bucks. Therefore, they're infected and spreading, prions everywhere. Like, people are killing the first legal buck or rack buck they see.
Right. So I think we see obviously there's people like you that will wait for the mature deer, and but that's not that common. I think for most people, a lot of people, like a trophy is 2 or 3 year old, right?
Yep.
That's good enough for most people, which again, there's no, that's not a bad or good thing. From
that's the reality for most places, I would say.
That's just what they choose to do. And, but there was a time, and you saw it in Pennsylvania, and there was definitely a time in Wisconsin and in Michigan where we're talking killing 90% of the bucks every year.
We were 96% of our bucks were 1.5, and we were smoking them.
Right. So we've done it. I bet you that the disease would have had it. Well, except for if they weren't killing does, but like, I bet the disease would have had a harder time getting a foothold back then.
Yeah.
I'm not saying like, we got to go to kill 90% of our bucks. But I think it doesn't take a super low, like, you can still get, if you're killing half your bucks a year, you're still getting, I think you're still going to have lots of trophies, basically.
And honestly, I think to our fault sometimes.
Let me just flush that out. If you kill half the bucks, I mean, how is that sustainable? Because
what do you mean? Well, then you've got a big recruitment of fawns coming in the next year.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So, but then the next year I kill the other half of them, then.
Well, if you're always killing a half, not the other half, it's just half.
Yeah.
Half.
Yeah. But that's where it goes back to how many are coming in from a recruitment versus how many are going out. Like, if it's on the
recruitment.
Yeah. If it's on the decline and you continue to remove that, well, every year half is less than the year previous, right? Because your population is decreasing.
Right.
I guess.
You can. So you imagine a scenario of 50% harvest rates. You're still getting 3, 4, 5 year old bucks.
Right.
If you had a 20% harvest rate, you'd have more of them, obviously.
Interesting.
But
I mean, do you think? And I say this because sometimes it's mine and Jared's fault of like, man, I wish people would pass 1 year olds or 2 year olds, whatever. That's just how our brains think. But if in a society standpoint, whatever, people started to say, well, I'm not going to kill 1 and 2 year olds. I'm only going to focus on 3, 4, and 5 year old bucks. Do you think that would expedite the disease's effects? You see what I'm saying?
Yes, I do. Unless it depends if you save the 1.5 and 2 year olds, but then you absolutely hammer
the 3, 4, 5s. Yeah.
Then I'm not so sure.
Because it's simply a numbers game, right? It's not okay.
I think you want to think about it in like, you want to think about like what's the average length of time these deer have to spread the disease. You just want to minimize it.
Yeah.
But obviously we're trying to balance this with all the other things.
Right.
Yeah.
Because there's more there inevitably are more 1.5-year-old bucks in the population of bucks than there are 5.5-year-old bucks, right? So if you when we say 50%, you're maybe thinking that proportionally to the number in each age structure, but it could be heavier weighted towards the younger bucks versus the other ones, or something like that.
In the meantime, are people studying like how to cure it, basically?
Actually, I think there are some people that are looking at the vaccine notion. Now, again, those are not
be mandatory.
Wildlife biologists, they're biochemists and stuff, right? So I can't speak their language. So that's the hope is something like that will arrive at some point. And then we'll be at the idea too is like, well, you want to manage to minimize prevalence because of all the bad things that happen when there's more deer that have disease, but that also makes your eventual job, if the miracle vaccine comes along,
easier.
If you need to treat, your job is then become much more easy if you've got lower prevalence.
Who does that? Who studies deer diseases and
company? Well, I mean the wildlife disease, which is in Georgia, is it still in Athens? The southern Squidus is down there. So I mean that is for now, right? That is the wildlife disease center. So that's where most of your research and studies and recommendations and things are coming out. But there's a lot of different places that produce like the vaccine side. In fact, like it's been 15 years, but we applied EHD and blue tongue vaccines to a lot of pen deer during EHD and blue tongue outbreaks in the South. And that was, you had to give it to them twice. Like, again, in a controlled setting, manageable. In a free range setting, right. I'm not sitting out there giving, shots under the skin, basically.
It'd have to be, that's the thing that,
it's oral.
So you can, well, in terms of who does it.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it's commercially viable.
Right.
I think it's going to have to be government and university researchers, because they're the ones that are going to do things that aren't necessarily going to lead to a profit. So those are the folks that are most likely, I think, to do that sort of work. But then let's say you get to the point of, we developed a vaccine. What's the delivery mechanism?
Yeah.
Because if you have to inject it, well, maybe captive, great.
Yeah.
And that'd be awesome. And that would be awesome from that standpoint.
Yeah.
But how do you deliver it to a wild population? That's the next thing. And with rabies, they deliver these baits, it's consumable, and they deliver it, aerially. So who knows?
The HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Better Backstrap.
Well, one thing that's undeniable, man, is you and I both like to eat. And so we're going to be partnering with the Better Backstrap this year to have the best seasonings possible for our meat this summer.
Yeah. Well, dude, when it comes to venison, it's like you've heard me talk about before. It's like, what does the preparation for all this look like and stuff? And it's like, I really want to make a point of eating more venison moving forward. And some of the Better Backstrap mixtures have made it super easy.
Yeah. And so we've got kind of 3 core mixtures. You've got your original Better Backstrap, which is for that grilling of your backstrap or tenderloins or anything like that. You've got your classic taco mix.
Can't go wrong with tacos.
Can't go wrong with that. And then you've got your standard SPG in the orange can.
Well, SPG and down the hatch.
There you go. So right now, if you go to betterbackstrap.com, you can use the code HUNTR15 to get 15% off any of your orders on the seasonings, and there'll probably be more coming out here throughout the year.
Get yourself a Better Backstrap.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder, and again, it's so early in the game on it, is like, if the wild populations are showing some selective measure to this resistant allele, I don't think
I
don't think that it'll ever rid the disease. However, if it expands
why not?
Because I don't think that they'll, maybe, I won't say forever, but like in the near future, I don't think that selective process happens fast enough that CWD is wiped off of the population. But if it extends the basically the lifespan, right, or the effective process of the disease from 18 to 24 months to 60 to 72 months, I mean, 98% of your deer will never see that age anyways. And
is it possible that has anything to do with like the flattening of your prevalence rates?
Maybe. I'm not sure, but that's definitely possible. Something that we need to, I've thought about that as well. And as of others, it could be. Now I want to throw some cold water on
bring it, man.
Stuff.
Yeah, bring it.
It may not be a good thing.
Okay.
And it's getting into the prion biology, which I'm not one of those people, but the prion, like if you talk to a prion biologist, which I've done plenty of times, friends and colleagues, prion is not a prion. There are actually strains. It's not because it's not an organism. There's not species, but they have different like shapes or whatever, for lack of a better term. And when the genetics change, the prion gene, which is what you're talking about, when that changes, apparently that can or does cause changes in cause a change in the strain. So again, the shape of this thing, the shape of this tiny molecule and how it interacts with all the other molecules could change. It may change for the better in what we would consider the better, or it may change for the worse. It who knows if it causes like changes in how like the host range. What if it causes it to be more transmissible to other critters?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm not saying like, oh, here's the future, it's going to happen. I'm just saying that the strain aspect of it throws more uncertainty into it. And that's why you just want fewer, like every infected deer is like a little biological experiment.
Yeah.
You want fewer of those biological experiments going on, right?
Yeah. Let me put you in the hot seat, Dan. How do you think this all started in Wisconsin?
Yeah, well, I can say I don't know, which is true.
Yeah. You don't know. You weren't there. I'm just,
yeah.
You know, what is yours and or the DNR's opinion of like, how did this start?
So this actually goes right back to the strain question. And from what I've learned from conversations with the folks that understand the strain stuff better, and that understanding is that the strain we have in Wisconsin, that we originally had in Wisconsin, is the same strain as they had in like Colorado, Wyoming.
Like in the 60s? Like original, like Fort Collins type?
Well, not like in the what they have in the population.
Yeah.
What they have in the population, which is I think the same as they have in the lab. Okay. And I'm not saying anything about how that whole thing started. But the point being is that the inference there, I guess, is that our CWD came from Colorado, Wyoming. And so then you're like, well, how? Deer didn't walk from Colorado. So, and there's to me, it's not a blame game at this point, because this is something that happened. Who knows when this happened? Yeah. It's people acting with not knowing what we know now. So is it that Wisconsin's got this great hunting tradition, and that includes a lot of folks going out west, hunting mule deer and stuff.
Yeah.
I've gone to taxidermists in Southwest Wisconsin and seeing the rows of mule deer and elk and stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Fine, totally great. Now, did that lead to like maybe people dumping the bones, the skeleton, whatever?
I'm sure it did. That's what we all did. That's how we got rid of stuff. Yeah.
And did that lead to CWD being introduced?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Was it a farm? Was it like a commercial deer farm? I don't know.
Right.
They would have, I don't know.
No, I mean, that's the part of it being the same strain that you see from the Colorado, Wyoming side would make me think a human movement of carcass, etc., is more likely than, at least in the Missouri side, where it seemed very much more penned to wild.
Well, how unique are they? I mean,
strains?
What are they?
That's a great question.
What are the odds? You're like, hey, this matches the one in Colorado, so it's definitely from there. Or it's like,
Yeah, great. That's a great question. So again, from what I understand from talking to the folks that really know, if it say, okay, think about the CWD that's popped up in Norway.
Mm-hmm.
They can tell that it's a different strain. How they can tell, I have no idea.
Yeah.
But they can tell, that is not related to any known CWD in North America. So that probably arose spontaneously, independently of anything happening in the States. But if that arose spontaneously in Wisconsin, well, then it'd be a different strain than what happens than what occurs in Colorado and Wyoming. So that's the inference. So how do they tell? I don't know.
You know how they know, Dan? Because the way it is.
The way it is.
It's all a bunch of biochemistry, and I never liked chemistry, so
it's interesting though to make that connection on that stuff. And yeah, I mean, it's
is a majority of your research dedicated to the disease portion of it? Is that like how big of a portion of your job is this study?
Well, this study was a huge part of my job, and as this study kind of, I mean, it's continuing, but it's never been the only part of my job. We talked about that hunter demographic stuff. That's another research project. We've got multiple research projects always because there's just frankly a lot of demand.
You guys have been doing some stuff on wolves too, right?
I mean, I haven't. We always the DNR is always collaring wolves and tracking movements, and a lot of that's for their sort of monitoring purposes and stuff.
Do you have any deer collared in the same range
as wolves?
Yeah.
We don't now. We did. So there was a study that started in 2011. Yeah. It started before I had my current position. And then when I came on, I kind of shepherded the completion of that. And that was a study that was done in two different places. One in the eastern farmland, kind of by Green Bay.
Yep.
And then another in our Northwoods, in what's called Sawyer County. It's just big woods, Northwoods. And so each study area collared like $500, I think.
Wow.
Like a lot of deer. 500 deer, I should know, but a lot of deer. Yeah. So we studied them in wolf range. Yeah.
And then the wolves eventually ate the collars.
The wolves, oh boy, I'm just gonna. You can't not get in trouble when you talk about wolves, right?
Yeah.
But what we found that was most important to me in that study was that if you had a severe winter, the wolves and the coyotes were going to clean up, and they're going to eat a lot of deer. Most of those deer were going to be the young of the year.
Yep. They were probably in trouble anyways from a winter mortality.
That's it. That's what I say. They were probably in trouble anyways, because you look at those deer that were predated, that were consumed, and you look at their bone marrow, and you're like, that deer was walking dead, maybe. When there's a mild winter, the predation rate isn't that high. So to me, what that says is, and a full adult, their survivals over winters pretty high, like pretty decent no matter what.
In the wolf range.
You would say they died with wolves, not of wolves.
Well, they're dying from wolves sometimes, but it's not like, the point is, to me, it's all about vulnerability. It's not about, for instance, you've got like a mild winter, and maybe you had less than 20% mortality on those fawns or something like that over winter. And then you have a severe winter, and you had your mortality rate doubles.
Yeah.
Well, the wolf population, and then the next year you got a mild winter again, and then so your mortality rate goes down. So the wolf population isn't like dropping in half and then doubling, right? So it's not the number of wolves that's driving the rate that the deer are getting killed. It's the winter severity, and also it's not just wolves; it's coyotes too.
Sure.
Even in wolf range, there's plenty of coyotes seemingly. So people don't like to hear that necessarily, and I understand.
Well,
I'm not saying that wolves.
No. You're right.
Their thing, but
it's compensatory though when you talk about the winter kill side, because unlike most of us in the lower part of the whitetail range in the lower 48, like when you guys have severe winters in the north, just like Michigan, just like Minnesota, I mean, it's devastating to, especially like you said, the young of the year side of things from a survival rate. And yeah, I mean, it seems clearly like that's the evidence that these wolves are just taking advantage of it. They're not adding mortality on top of it necessarily.
They're probably not adding a lot. It's probably mostly compensatory. That's how I view it. That's what I think is happening. So again, like if we had fewer wolves, would we have more deer? I think the expectation is that yes, we'd have a lot more deer, and that we're not seeing the deer that we want to see because of wolves. We're going to have a wolf season probably. I'm not making, I'm just saying like prediction wise.
Yeah.
I've got no insight, but someday.
Yep.
And will we see more deer as a result? I'm not certain. I wouldn't put money on it, or at least a large increase.
Do you think the habitat is the restrictor at that point? Yeah. Yep. I would agree. Well, one thing that dawned on me, not to just keep harping on the CWD side, but you know, a lot of people, and I wouldn't say this is necessarily general deer hunter language, but a lot of people talk about density dependent versus frequency dependent on that disease. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think when we talk about the sharpshooting, especially, you know, people immediately are like, well, wait a minute, it's not a density dependent disease, it's a frequency dependent disease. Why are we removing? But clearly throughout this podcast, we discussed the importance of, you know, lowering the deer population, thus the density as well.
Yeah, but so there's the mistaken assumption that if it's frequency dependent, then culling doesn't matter. That's actually not true. That's why when I was talking about, well, how does culling work? And I talked about it shortening the lifespan of these infected deer. That's not a density dependent argument. That's frequency. That works for frequency dependent. So if you've got density dependent disease transmission, what that means is you just get a more of an effect because you get that life shortening effect, and then you get fewer contacts because there's fewer deer. That's really tricky because of deer behavior. And again, that was my PhD was supposed to unravel all that and be the definitive. It's this or this, and it really, you know,
right.
Then life happens. But it's so like on the high end, if you've got really high deer densities, you're certainly having more overlap, and so there's probably more opportunity for like especially indirect contact, right?
Yeah,
because they're pooping and all that stuff in the same area. And so, but the question is, like, if you lower it to a certain extent, are the deer that are left, are they going to like seek each other out? Because that would maintain transmission at a low density.
Right.
There's things like that to my knowledge, haven't quite sussed out. And I think it's probably not strongly density dependent, but that doesn't mean that culling increasing harvest won't be effective.
Yep, that makes sense. Yeah, that's a big one. I mean, and again, that's probably more of the higher level arguments that you start to hear out there than just like the average deer hunter argument. But yeah, they're intertwined so tightly that you know, that's just how it is. The unraveling is the difficult part.
It is. I mean, you know, we'll never understand it fully. We won't necessarily have to understand it fully to adequately manage it. But
well, man, I think that was pretty awesome.
Yeah, it was
Have
cool.
I exhausted you?
No, man, that was we've had, I don't know, not a lot, a few CWD conversations. Some usually just end up, you know, fishtailing in at the end of a conversation or something, you know. Some with like a Tonk or Jason Sumner's might have been a little bit more, but like this was, I would say, like our first like real CWD conversation. But I'm glad we dove into some of this other stuff too. I think that's really
well, from a like stats around mortality, especially, you know what I mean? Like we talked with Seabury, that was very, you know, focused on, but it was more on like, that allele portion
the gene
of it, you know,
side of things,
and what attempts are being made there and stuff. And so it's interesting to hear, you know, you kind of mentioned that as well, and be open to considering that as a potential, you know, flattening of what we're seeing up there.
And the understanding of, is it actually a good thing? Like maybe it is, maybe it isn't.
Yeah. Well, and just, I think it's nice to hear, you know, you're not all doom and gloom about it, which is encouraging. You know what I mean? It's like, we've heard some people are like, hey, deer, 20 years gone, you know what I mean? And we're like, that can't be the case, you know? And I think still at the end of the day, there's like some open-endedness or uncertainty around the prescription of it. Like even having heard all of our stuff, I'm still like, okay, so yes, fewer, better. I get it. But also do anything? I don't know.
Well, yeah, because I mean, I was going to say, like on the Wisconsin side, being like you guys have the biggest data set from a documentation and following, like it's been, you're besides like the normal harvest prescriptions, like it's a pretty hands-off approach right now, right?
From a harvest standpoint. Like, so when I say that, I'm saying like, for example, and you know, you could argue, and I'm sure I'll get blamed because it's the baiting thing. I have, you know, my own gripes with baiting, but from a CW to put it in this argument, it's like, that seems like a no-brainer. It's like, okay, you just get rid of baiting and or any other potential, you know, congregation sites that we can control. Is that going to solve it? We can't control
scrapes.
No. Yeah. No. So, and the goal there just being, hey, reduce the likelihood of transmission, you know what I mean? In areas where it's already low, let's keep it low if we can.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but then from a harvest standpoint, that's where I'm kind of like, well, you know, is it what it is? And I don't know.
Yeah. All the questions you got to still answer, Dan, at some point.
Right. Come back to me in a year. Like that.
Yeah. Well, we will. No, you've given us a lot.
I'll figure it out then.
Yeah. No, it really has been, it's been a good conversation because I think a lot of people, I mean, I've gone through a lot of stuff, and this is no knock on the research community because we obviously talked about, you know, Southeast Deer Study Group, and like those meetings are great. Unfortunately, none of that ever really reaches the general hunting public, right? That bridge between what the research community does and finds and the connection to the everyday deer hunter is very wide and typically is intercepted by somebody that manipulates it 7 times over before it actually gets to the deer hunter.
Well, sorry, go ahead. You first, Dan.
I was just gonna say that's why, you know, we as an agency, we can do better, obviously, in how we get our message out. But also there's like, look, you guys have more credibility with a lot of hunters than I do. That's just the reality that we have to accept. But you got folks like Bronson Strickland, and I don't know him personally, but I know you've had him.
Yeah, Bronson's awesome.
He's a great, like, we need 10 of him.
Yeah.
Right. And we need him and those types of folks to be in more outlets. I think the NDA material, the National Deer Association material, they give you a lot of informative stuff, and it's out there. It should be out there more, perhaps. There's a part we can try to play, but there's only so much, you know.
It's society. I mean, and it's one of the reasons we have this podcast is to continue to, you know, connect the general public with things that we believe, you know, and I mean, we don't know everything, but we believe are important issues, important discussions to have.
You do.
Yeah. But at the same time, there are a lot of people with a lot larger platforms than us that may be saying the right thing or the wrong thing or nothing at all. And, you know, I think Jared and I have had conversations of like, you know, how do we get these guys involved and how do we, you know, help use their platforms to continue to deliver messages that need to get out there, because that is who the mass hunting public is getting their information from.
Yeah.
I think that, and we didn't get to touch on it a whole lot today, but I think the fact that you guys are studying like the social elements of, you know, or repercussions of like whatever season dates, bag limit, like the human element of that, I think is huge and is missed a lot by most states. You know what I mean? It's like there's a consideration for that. They're like, well, you know, we did a poll, and it's like, all right, okay, but you know, on a broad spectrum and years down the road, like how do these things that we're, you know, changing about how we hunt the animals, especially, is like what what impacts do those have? You know, and in Jeremy and I's opinion, it's like that's had the greatest impact. You know, for some of the I touched on it real early on. We talked about the access thing. You know, I mean, that's where that all kind of lies. So it's cool to know that you are dipping your toe in that.
Yeah, and I think understanding hunters is at least as important as the deer.
I agree.
Probably more so. Like
Sure.
we've recognized that. We do have some social scientists, but I think just like expanding our look at what's happening with deer hunters and like what can we do about what's happening with deer hunters. And anyway, yeah, it's super critical because we can't do any, we don't really do anything, right? I mean, it's the hunters that do. It's the hunters that do the actions. And so
we need them.
Well, we'll volunteer as rats for your lab if you have. You know what I mean? If you're like, hey, why do hunters do this or that? We're happy to tell you.
We always like to be the rats, or if anyone says, hey, we've got this initiative, and if Jared and I are like, we can get behind that, we'll be the tip of the spear.
I'll say that between Jeremy and I, give me the placebo. So.
Well, cool, man. Well, Dan, we appreciate it, buddy. Thanks so much for just talking through that, and I think you did an awesome job too, by the way. So if anybody at the DNR is like, oh no, how'd it go? And they're like, I don't know. If nothing
else, the Wisconsin DNR is well spoken.
Yeah, so. You guys are well spoken. Yeah, you and Jeff did a great job on this. Sometimes it's difficult. And like we literally, like I have your thing here. I think I looked at it once, but like it's just a conversation, you know, and the conversation is just spurring other questions and discussions and like, yeah, it's like three guys just sitting around in a deer camp saying, well, what about this? You know, and that's a good idea. I don't know. How about this? And that's...
I'll put something out there.
Yeah, we just want to have that kind of conversation. And I think oftentimes, especially, again, from the research community or the DNR side, that gets pushed away from the general public because, like we said at the beginning, it's an emotional topic. And there will be... Not regardless of how well you did, Dan, don't read all the comments
or any. Yeah,
trust me.
But that's just it. And you know what? As long as it's
you read Jeff's and he can read yours.
Yeah. As long as it's somewhat thought through, like even if you don't agree with what was said, as long as we got you thinking, and you at least were for 10 minutes. You know, you decided that you're going to think about this and you're going to write something that you just don't agree. That's fine. That's the whole point. Like, I'm okay with that. But there'll be frivolous comments too that were just like, okay.
And to the comments, I mean, like, you know, people are free to, I mean, I don't have stone tablets here, right? I've got, you know, my research and our opinion. It's okay for people to disagree and for people to tell me I'm an idiot. That's fine.
No.
All right.
Well, listen.
We'll let it roll.
Before the last thing I'll say before I let you go, and it's because I worked on them. I assume you have frequent conversations with Brian Richards.
Yeah.
Tell him he needs to come on. He avoided it once.
Oh, really? He needs to come on.
But I say that because we have a lot of people from the other side of the table, if you get my drift, that want to come on and talk. And I'd rather. But I'll do that and I will entertain that. But I need people like you and Brian on the other side to say, because without that, it's just we become the platform that just has one side talking. And I
mean, Brian's excellent, and there's others too, and there's others too that are as good and better than me for sure about speaking to these things, and I always forward you to those folks too.
I just put in a good word. Just say, hey, listen, we weren't that bad on you.
All right. Yeah. Sounds good. Thanks a lot. Hey, I really appreciate your time. It was fun.
And awesome.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, dude, we're not just like puffing them up there. You know, I mean, this Wisconsin guys
they are very well spoken.
Yeah. Well, and I just appreciate Dan's. I'm clearly passionate about his work. I mean, it's not just a job for him. You know, he's.
Well, I thought you made a good point. Like, I didn't feel doomsday talking to him.
Yeah. Well, yeah, he seems to have he's a real person too. Yeah, I mean, he can be a scientist. It's like, well, here's what the data says, you know, but whatever, you know.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh okay, yeah.
Yeah, take it for what it's worth.
I got you.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think, like, key points from that, like, and that's one of the reasons we had it was when he released this research is, like, clearly the deer and especially the bucks that are infected have a dramatically lower survival rate annually, like 4 times.
Seems that way. Yep.
Per the data.
Right.
Why? I thought we hit on some good things there. Like it would seem like for some reason they're more vulnerable to hunter kills.
Sure.
If that is the number one reason that bucks are getting killed is hunters, and that they have that, like, maybe.
Well, yeah, I mean, just regardless, it's, it's believable to that they're dying of something else. You know what I mean? Like that's, I get it. I think that's fairly common with other diseases too. I can see the crossover.
And obviously, a bit naive on it, but like, for sure, I would say the most definitive conversation on I find dead CWD deer. Right? Like he even says it. He's like, that's the number one question I get is like, have you ever found one? He's like, yeah, a lot of them.
Right.
And which is weird because
seems like an unwillingness to acknowledge the actual cause of death is the only thing that could tease those apart.
Yeah.
Like if somebody else would look at that and say like, well, no, it died of starvation.
Right.
And he's saying, well, yeah, but
that's because of the holes in the brain.
Right. So, I mean, if there is a discrepancy
and that maybe
you can't dispute dead bodies. I mean, you can only dispute why it's dead.
Exactly. So same thing with like pneumonia. Like I think over 50% of them had pneumonia. Well, are you just saying that pneumonia killed it and CWD didn't? Because it wouldn't have pneumonia if it didn't have CWD.
Right. The lack of just reported observations seems odd in comparison to his study. He's like, yeah, no, a lot of them died. And we're not that we're doing a polling or anything, but like we're not hearing Wisconsinites be like, yeah, there's dead deer, a lot of them. Right?
I don't know. Or they're thinking they're EHD deer.
I don't know.
Like, I mean, can't tell the difference, I bet.
Sure. I don't know.
Yeah, good. Also, I mean, it's starting to...
There's deer that die every year. You don't know why. I found deer on our property that I was shed hunting. I was like, okay, there's $4 I found. I'm like, I don't know why.
Yeah, and I mean... except for those counties that are really the focus point. But I mean, it sounds like most of these places in Wisconsin have a higher deer population than they've ever had. Yeah. Which is also kind of like maybe where some of the hard grasping is like, what do you mean? There's deer everywhere type of thing. Honestly, and I get it, why people in Missouri are pissed off with they're like, look at all the shooting and like Wisconsin's not doing anything. They've got high deer populations and we're just like... I don't think it's as much as the killing of the deer in general as much as it is who and how they're doing it. They're doing it after the season, and it's contractual with mainly MDC agents. I don't know if they're using some sharpshooters, maybe, but mainly MDC agents going into the neighbor's farm. They're probably not a hunter, and they're like, yeah, kill 15 of them. I don't give a shit. Like, whatever you want to do.
Well, and with the sharpshooting, I mean, especially in Illinois, I mean, there's corn piles and there's like, it's not at night and it's everything that's not hunting,
Yeah. So I'm not saying that people wouldn't have a problem with just people killing deer, but it's the way that it's getting done, how it's getting done. It's all of that perception of it. Maybe, and the department may say, well, but this is the most lethal way to get it done. And but
you're pissing off your...
Is it the only way?
No.
So that's where I think, and I thought you made a good comment to him on the social side. That's where social's not even in consideration at that point.
Mm-hmm. And that's why we're doing it. We're getting it done.
And it needs to be.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying to sacrifice the end goal, but you got to consider it because you lose the support of those guys, which in most cases they have, then, I mean, your entire foundation, your house will crumble basically. So yeah, and again, Dan will say it too. It's like not like Wisconsin's doing everything right, but I mean, I think if you give those two guys, especially him and Jeff, very capable guys. Problem there is the legislator above it, because they don't have the control. Dan could give you the best research. This could be the best thing that ever comes out on CWD. But if the legislature is like, well, listen, we can't support this because I won't get voted back in, biology or not, doesn't matter what Dan says or what Jeff says.
Sure. Well, and that's, statewide or, countrywide.
And most of them. Yep. Or it's commission based. So, yeah, I mean, but that's the importance of everybody listening to this having an opinion, having good discussions, and because you can go to the legislature and change them. They're puppets.
Mm-hmm.
No offense if you're listening.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? Like, you're going to do what your constituents tell you to do. They work for you. If Dan says it's great and goes to him, doesn't mean shit. If 5,000 of his constituents come to him and say, hey, this is what needs to happen, he listens or she listens. Just like in Iowa. I mean, you saw the post the other day of IWC. They flooded the Capitol when they were going to put these bills through, and they killed them all. And it's like, that's a coordinated effort that went right to the heart, to where the legislatures were, here's all my constituents. I don't want to piss them off because I need voted back in. So they went with what they said. It's not that hard. But right now there's a disconnect between what's happening there and what we all are doing and who we're talking to. And I would say that, and I know I don't do it probably often enough. I did it. We were just talking about the USGS stuff. Like, I did it recently here to write my representatives to say, hey, I know you're considering cuts to the USGS wildlife cooperatives. I'm not in favor of it for these reasons. But I would say that on a normal basis, most of us don't write our legislature to say, hey, we feel strongly about X and would like you to do something about it. Mm-hmm. We just don't. We bitch about it in circles or on social media. And honestly, for us, it's tough because as non-residents, we don't have a voice. Mm-hmm. Right? Like in Ohio, I can write them, and I have in Kentucky. And thankfully, some of these guys have been gracious enough to write me back because I'm a landowner, but I have no voting power there.
Right.
So doesn't matter, really, at the end of the day. It's honestly a personal thing if they actually would write you back and listen to what you say, because they don't really need to.
Yeah.
But that's, I think we take that for granted, that we all have a voice that could be leveraged to make decisions happen, and we don't use it enough.
For sure. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm guilty of that too. I feel like this is the best we can do. You know what I mean? I'm like, I agree. If we can sit here and, you know what I mean, whether they ever hear this or not, but if other people do and then reach out directly, I'm like, you know, it does create a,
I mean, we have
a stir,
transparently, we don't really have a stake in the game in Wisconsin.
Right.
At all. We don't hunt there.
Right.
We know people that
might
live
not
there.
ever hunt there.
Yeah, we have friends that live there that own property and then hunt there. But yeah, we may never. But it's important enough of an issue that use what we have here to make sure that people understand it's an important issue.
Yeah.
And because it's a trickle down, you know. And what if Wisconsin actually figures it out and gets their shit straight?
Well, it affects states that we're into. I mean, here they're connected to exactly the same people that we talk to in Ohio or in Kentucky, and so it's all. You know, I mean,
it's there. It's all intertwined.
The world of deer. You know, people who can impact deer decisions at the state level is not that big of a group of people. And they can be influenced, you know what I mean, by conversations like this and by, like you're saying, people reaching out directly and stuff.
I think Dan, I mean, even in this, I bet he would say there's several things that we talked about there that he's like, that's not a bad idea, and we haven't discussed that.
Yeah.
Which is good.
That's the whole parcel level. That's a big.
It's just to have any talking and discussion level and getting you thinking is important, because we just don't do nearly as much as we used to. But yeah, it's a good place to start. Whether you agree or disagree, it's healthy.
Yeah, well, and it's helpful to see a face behind it too. So you're like, get to the root of, you're like, oh, well, you know, he seems like a reasonable guy, and I'm like, yeah, you know. So I was like, well, maybe I hear him out. You know, it's like, oh, well, he's got some valid points here.
Once you get on and have a conversation, you're like, okay, like he's passionate about it, he gets it. I think he's smart, but he also can just, you know, kind of shoot the shit and talk. Like that's critical.
I like him. Yeah,
I like him. So anyways, we appreciate Dan Storm from Wisconsin DNR coming on and talking about CWD and a lot of the other research projects that they have. You probably won't get that on the last part, but you know, take a minute if you got time now. Look at USGS wildlife and fisheries cooperatives. Those are things that are possibly on the table for being cut from this federal thing, whether you're for or against the federal cuts that are happening. You know, make your own decision, but I would do some research on what those guys have done for your state from a research standpoint. Here in Pennsylvania, a lot of stuff out of Dwayne Diefenbach's office at Penn State, but important for wildlife management and wildlife disease moving forward. So if you are in support of that, you might want to write your local congressman or woman or whatever you would call that to tell them that you think it's important. So other than that, we appreciate everyone listening to episode 240 of HUNTR Podcast, and we'll catch y'all next week.
Later.
Take me